The conflict, later known as the Wars of the Roses, did not begin with a single clear moment. Its roots lie in a long chain of political tensions, rival ambitions, and fragile royal authority in 15th century England. Among the figures who stood at the centre of this unfolding crisis was Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. He was the son of Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and a great-grandson of King Edward III. His bloodline placed him among the strongest claimants to the English throne. Had King Henry VI died before the year 1453, York would almost certainly have become king, since few other living men possessed a lineage so closely tied to the royal house. Because of this position within the aristocracy and the royal family, York believed he should play an important role in the governance of the kingdom and in the king's council. Yet Henry VI often placed his trust elsewhere, particularly in Edmund Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, a man whose influence at court would become a source of deep resentment. Somerset also had a distant link to the royal line through John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. Although this connection had begun as an illegitimate branch of the family, it had later been formally recognised by Parliamentary Act. Even with this recognition, many nobles regarded the claim with suspicion. For York, the situation was particularly difficult. He saw Somerset as an unworthy rival whose judgment was poor and whose advice often harmed the kingdom. The Duke disliked almost everything about him: his leadership, his ambitions, and above all the favour he enjoyed in the king's presence. Despite this rivalry, the king could not entirely ignore York. In 1436, he appointed him Lieutenant of France, placing him in charge of England's struggling war effort on the continent. York carried out this responsibility with determination, even though the Crown failed to provide sufficient funds. To maintain the English forces, he paid soldiers and officers from his own fortune, eventually contributing a vast sum of money to sustain the campaign. Under difficult conditions, he achieved some success, though the lack of royal financial support continually undermined his efforts. Several years later, the situation changed dramatically. In 1447, the king removed York from his command in France and assigned him a new role as Lieutenant of Ireland. This appointment effectively forced him away from the centre of English politics. At the same time, Somerset replaced him in France, was raised to the rank of Duke, and received a large advance of royal funds to support the army overseas. The contrast was striking. York had spent enormous sums of his own money in the king's service and had still not been repaid. By that time, the Crown owed him an amount exceeding £38,000. Somerset, on the other hand, was given generous financial backing despite lacking the wealth or resources to support the government himself. York's personal fortunes were considerable, strengthened further by his marriage to Cicely Neville, a member of one of the richest and most powerful families in England. Yet wealth could not erase the humiliation he felt at being pushed aside while his rival gained influence. When Somerset returned to England in 1450, his reputation had been damaged by events in France. One of the most serious setbacks had been the surrender of the city of Rouen, which contributed to the collapse of English control over Normandy. Despite this failure, the king welcomed him warmly and restored him to a position of great influence at court. While Somerset remained close to the king, his popularity among the wider population was extremely low. Public anger towards several royal advisers erupted in a major uprising known as Jack Cade's Rebellion. The movement presented itself as a voice for the grievances of ordinary people and targeted leading nobles associated with the royal government. The unrest alarmed the court and ultimately led to the exile and murder of the Duke of Suffolk, another controversial figure within the king's inner circle. At this point, Richard of York could only watch events unfold with growing frustration. He had financed military campaigns, lent money to the crown, and remained loyal despite repeated slights. Yet his rival had taken his position in France and continued to gain the king's confidence. In September 1450, York returned from Ireland and landed in North Wales before making his way toward London. His arrival caused anxiety among royal advisors, who feared that he might be planning to challenge the government directly. Attempts were made to stop him before he reached the capital, but York appeared before the king, presenting himself not as a rebel, but as a defender of lawful government. He claimed that his purpose was to restore order and remove corrupt advisors who had damaged the kingdom. Because many people shared his dissatisfaction with the royal administration, York enjoyed considerable public support. Faced with pressure from both nobles and commoners, the king temporarily stepped back from confrontation. For a time, the fragile balance between York and Somerset remained intact. Events in France soon worsened the situation. In June 1451, the city of Bordeaux and the entire region of Gascony fell to the forces of the French king Charles VII. York quickly blamed Somerset for the loss, arguing that the government had ignored his earlier warnings about the war effort. Public confidence in the royal leadership was already weak, and this military disaster intensified criticism of the king's advisors. Convinced that drastic action was necessary, York decided to demonstrate his strength. He gathered an army and moved toward London in early 1452, hoping to force political changes and remove Somerset from influence. However, he misjudged the willingness of other nobles to support such a bold move. When he advanced with his troops, only a small number of lords joined him. Even so, York continued forward and established a camp on the open ground of Blackheath, just outside the capital. The royal government prepared for a confrontation, but several advisors preferred negotiation to open warfare. Influential nobles attempted to mediate between the two sides in hopes of preventing bloodshed. York declared that he would dismiss his army if Somerset were placed on trial for the disastrous conduct of the war in France. Representatives of the king appeared to agree with these conditions, and it was widely believed that Henry himself had given approval. Trusting the agreement, York disbanded his forces. Yet when he entered the king's presence, he discovered that Somerset remained at the king's side and that he himself was being placed under arrest. York spent several months in custody and was eventually released only after swearing a solemn oath that he would never again raise arms against the king. The political landscape shifted again soon afterward. An English expedition under the command of the Earl of Shrewsbury briefly recaptured Bordeaux, raising hopes that England might recover its position in France. At the same time, Queen Margaret of Anjou announced that she was expecting a child. For York, this news was troubling, since the birth of a royal heir would further weaken his own prospects of succession. But these developments did not bring lasting stability. In August 1453, the English army suffered a crushing defeat near Castillon in Gascony. Shrewsbury was killed and the last English forces in the region collapsed. The shock of this disaster had a devastating effect on King Henry VI, who fell into a profound mental breakdown that left him incapable of governing. With the king unable to rule, the question of leadership became urgent. Somerset understood that his authority depended entirely on the king's support, and that, without it, his position was vulnerable. He attempted to organise a meeting of leading nobles to decide who should govern during the king's illness. His intention was to secure the position of protector for himself, and to improve his chances he did not invite York to attend. However, a powerful group of nobles intervened and overturned his plan. Among them were Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and his son Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. These two men declared that York should serve as protector of England, while the king remained incapacitated. Their decision was not sudden. Earlier disputes had already strained relations between the Neville family and Somerset. The king had granted certain estates in Glamorgan to Somerset that had previously belonged to Warwick. This loss created lasting resentment. Tensions also escalated through a violent feud between the Neville family and the Percy family in northern England. An attack on a Neville wedding procession triggered a series of retaliatory raids between the two noble houses. Seeking allies in this conflict, the Nevilles turned toward the Duke of York. York recognised an opportunity. In exchange for their support against the Percys, he secured their backing in his struggle against Somerset. With the Nevilles now firmly on his side, Somerset found himself politically outmanoeuvred. For more than a year, York effectively governed the kingdom as protector. Somerset was imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges connected to the failures in France. Meanwhile, the Neville family gained the upper hand in their regional feud with the Percys. Yet this arrangement lasted only until January 1455, when the king unexpectedly recovered from his illness. With Henry restored to authority, York's protectorate came to an abrupt end, and Somerset was released from imprisonment. The Percy family also regained confidence under renewed royal support and aligned themselves with Somerset against the Nevilles. The political divisions that had been forming for years now hardened into opposing camps. Recognising the danger of this new alliance, York, Warwick, and Salisbury quietly left London and returned to their northern territories. There, they began gathering supporters and preparing for a renewed struggle for influence. On the opposite side stood King Henry VI, Somerset, and the Percy family. From this moment, the kingdom was effectively divided between two rival factions. Those loyal to the king and the house associated with Lancaster would later be known as the Lancastrians. Their opponents, supporters of the Duke of York and his allies, became known as the Yorkists. The stage was set for open conflict. During the spring of 1455, the royal government attempted one last effort to resolve the growing crisis. A council of nobles was planned for late May in the city of Leicester. Invitations were sent across the kingdom, including to York and his allies. The stated purpose was to discuss threats to the safety of the king and restore stability. York suspected that the meeting might be a trap designed to eliminate him. Instead of attending peacefully, he decided to intercept the king before the council could begin. Accompanied by Salisbury, Warwick, and roughly 3,000 armed men, he marched south along the Great North Road toward London. The royal court quickly learned of this movement. The king sent a letter warning York that if he failed to dismiss his army, he would be declared a traitor. Receiving no reply, Henry VI left London with his own force, hoping to avoid a confrontation near the capital, where York enjoyed strong support among the population. The royal army was relatively small, composed of only a few thousand soldiers, many armed with pikes and bills. Even so, urgent summonses were sent to other nobles requesting their assistance. The fight at St. Albans unfolded so suddenly that the royal side seemed stunned by the speed of the assault. For much of that morning, the expectation had been that words would win the day, just as they had during earlier standoffs. Many of the soldiers present were prepared for negotiation, not a headlong rush. When the Yorkists surged forward, the first shock nearly worked in their favour. But once it became clear that real combat had begun, defenders poured into the narrow lanes and crowded around the gates. Those tight streets, meant to protect a town from raiders, now worked against the attackers. Even with greater numbers, the Yorkists found themselves squeezed into bottlenecks and cut down under concentrated resistance. In the middle of that pressure, a decisive move changed everything. Whether the Earl of Warwick had been pushing directly at one of the main approaches, or had pulled back from a blocked advance, he returned to men held in reserve near the higher ground, and then led them along an unexpected route. Instead of hammering at the fortified entry points, he threaded his way through back gardens and hidden passages behind the marketplace, using the town's layout like a weapon. While other Yorkist forces kept the gate defenders pinned in place, Warwick's group slipped forward unnoticed. Then, at a point close to the heart of St. Albans, his men burst out into the open and struck straight into the Lancastrian line near the main street, opposite the king's position. Trumpets sounded, a shouted war cry cut through the noise, and the line defending the royal party split. In one moment, the fighting was no longer a controlled defence at the gates, but a chaotic struggle inside the town itself, with the Lancastrians suddenly threatened from the rear. News that Yorkist troops had broken into the streets triggered panic. Gate defenders, who had been holding firm now, feared they were about to be trapped. The will to stand collapsed in sections, and men began to fall back in disorder. That retreat opened the gates, and Yorkist soldiers poured in through entrances that were no longer properly guarded. The remaining royal troops tried to regroup around the king in the marketplace. Henry himself stayed in place, remarkably still amid the turmoil, while combat raged around him. But Warwick's men were already in striking range and began loosing arrows at close distance. The effect was brutal. It was not only the casualties that mattered, it was the sense that the royal party had lost control of the fight in the space of minutes. The surprise was so complete that several leading figures were wounded almost immediately. The king was injured and the Duke of Buckingham was struck as well. Other nobles received wounds of varying severity. The pattern of injuries told its own story. Many men had not even finished putting on their helmets when the blow landed. There was no slow build, no gradual escalation, just a sudden breach and a violent rush through the centre. After that, the battle did not drag on. The remaining struggle was short, fierce and final, lasting less than an hour. Amid the crush and confusion, Lord Clifford was killed after managing to reach the main street, cut down in the close quarters fighting. The Earl of Northumberland also died while trying to force a path to safety near an inn at a street corner. Some important men were captured rather than slain, including nobles who found themselves surrounded, once the royal line fractured. A few managed to escape in the turmoil, slipping away as the Yorkists surged through the streets. Somerset's fate was harsher than most. After the collapse near one of the lanes, he reached refuge inside an inn. But he understood what capture would mean. Instead of surrendering, he chose to fight. When the defenders outside the building were overwhelmed, he led a final push out into the street, striking down several opponents, before being brought down himself. As the last resistance crumbled, Yorkist soldiers pressed toward the king, who by then was almost alone in the marketplace. Even the man carrying the royal standard had fled. In that moment, Henry's words mattered more than his weapons. He reminded the men facing him that he was an anointed king, and the frenzy around him eased just enough for his captors to take control without killing him. He was led away from the immediate danger and placed under guard in a nearby safe location, after which the Yorkist leaders approached him formally. They knelt, asked for forgiveness, and then, with astonishing bluntness, urged him to share in their celebration of Somerset's death. Henry granted pardon, and the earlier threats of severe punishment, spoken only hours before, seemed to vanish under the pressure of the new reality. The Neville faction had its own reasons to celebrate as well, since two of their bitter rivals lay dead. York rode close to the king, Salisbury. York rode close to the king. Salisbury took the other side, and Warwick moved ahead bearing a symbol of royal authority. In a single morning of fighting, York had gained what years of petitions and frustration had not delivered: control. Though Henry still wore the crown, York now held the machinery of government, formally installed again as protector and defender of the realm through legal recognition and royal assent later that year. St. Albans did not end with neat order. There was looting, confusion, and the usual aftermath of a town battle where men scattered for plunder and prisoners. That chaos may well have helped certain figures slip away. Stories later grew around these escapes, including tales of disguises and quiet departures, some plausible and some shaped by the desire to add drama. Other stories clustered around Somerset himself, including claims that he feared dying in the shadow of a castle and avoided fortresses because of a prediction. Whether that belief truly guided his choices or whether later, writers simply enjoyed the irony of his death near an inn with a castle name is impossible to prove. What is clear is that his end became part of a larger narrative, retold in a way that made the moment feel fated. Warwick's breakthrough also became a subject of debate. Some later voices credited it to sharp tactical vision, the ability to spot an opening and act decisively. Others suggested something simpler. The main approaches were too costly, so an alternative route was attempted, and fortune did the rest. There were even suggestions that one of Warwick's captains may have led the move, and that Warwick took the acclaim afterward. But battles are remembered by outcomes, not committee notes. Whatever the exact chain of decisions, that sudden strike into the marketplace lifted Warwick's reputation and pushed him toward the image that would follow him for years. The nobleman who could make and unmake kings. York's renewed hold on power did not last forever. Within a short time, the king asserted that he was fit to rule again, and York was removed from office once more. Behind the scenes, Queen Margaret of Anjou drove much of this shift. After the birth of her son, she became increasingly determined to secure the child's inheritance and to prevent York from ever presenting himself as the natural successor. She travelled through key regions, building alliances and gathering support for the royal cause. Over the next 2 years, Yorkist sympathisers, who had gained office during York's protectorate, were gradually pushed out by political pressure and replaced with men loyal to the Queen's faction. York and Salisbury withdrew north to their estates, watching carefully as the Queen tightened her grip. Warwick, meanwhile, held Calais, a strategic post that had been granted during York's period of dominance. Margaret tried to remove him, but the fortress and its garrison were not easily controlled from London. Money was the real lever, and in time the flow of funds meant to support Calais was cut off. Warwick now faced a basic problem. Soldiers demanded wages, and unpaid men became dangerous. Without support from the government, he turned to the sea, launching raids against foreign shipping to fund the garrison. These actions enriched his troops and fed a popular image of Warwick as bold and ruthless. But they also gave his enemies a legal weapon. He was accused of exceeding his authority and faced proceedings that framed his sea raids as criminal acts bordering on treason. When he was summoned to London to answer these charges, the atmosphere turned ugly. A confrontation erupted on his arrival, and Warwick fought his way out, returning to Calais while claiming that an attempt had been made on his life. From this point, the fragile balance of power slid steadily toward open conflict. With Warwick now branded a threat, and with York and Salisbury separated and isolated, Margaret played a decisive card. A council was called where the great lords gathered, while York and his closest allies were pointedly excluded. At this meeting, the Yorkist leaders were accused of treason, a move designed to strip them of legitimacy and leave them exposed to arrest and destruction. York understood what that kind of council could mean. Rather than wait to be cornered, he made plans of his own. He chose a meeting place at Ludlow and prepared to assemble an armed coalition. Salisbury would march south with men from the north, and Warwick would bring a hardened contingent from Calais. Together, they intended to confront the royal faction, seize the king, and restore their influence by force, repeating the basic pattern that had succeeded in earlier crises. Warwick crossed from Calais and narrowly avoided interception by the new Duke of Somerset, who had been tasked with watching the Midlands. Despite the danger, Warwick reached Ludlow safely. At the same time, the royal side raised forces in the Midlands. Another Lancastrian army, gathered in the west and northwest, was moving in position to block Salisbury before he could join York. Salisbury left his northern stronghold with a force that likely numbered only a few thousand, marching along roads that would take him toward Ludlow. He travelled with experienced captains and close relatives, while his army carried the standard mix of the age: archers, billmen, pikemen, and the baggage that followed any large medieval force. The royal commanders attempted to cut him off, but Salisbury evaded the main block. Recognising the danger of a combined Yorkist army, Margaret ordered a local commander, Lord Audley, to intercept Salisbury, detain him, and prevent the junction. Messages were also sent to the Stanley brothers, powerful figures in the region whose support could tip a local campaign. Their position was complicated. Assurances were offered to the Queen, but their family ties pulled them in different directions, and they hesitated to commit decisively. One moved closer to Salisbury, the other kept a careful distance, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Audley and his second-in-command marched out with a sizable force, including a strong cavalry element. Salisbury's scouts sighted the enemy forming positions near a long hedge that partly concealed their line. Salisbury approached and chose ground that gave him a defensive advantage, placing his troops on higher land near a small stream. Wagons were formed into a protective enclosure, creating a stable anchor point. Stakes were set to blunt cavalry charges. A trench was dug behind the line to slow any breakthrough and to discourage panic retreats. It was the posture of a commander who knew he was outnumbered and intended to make the enemy pay for every step forward. The first major movement came when the Lancastrian cavalry advanced. Accounts differ about why it happened. One version suggests Salisbury drew his centre back in a way that looked like retreat, tempting the enemy into a reckless pursuit. Another view is simpler. The pressure of numbers and the need to avoid being crushed at the main approach's forced movement, and the Lancastrians interpreted it as weakness. In any case, the cavalry pushed down toward the stream, crossed difficult ground, and climbed toward the Yorkist line. As they came into range, Yorkist archers answered with volleys that cut into the attack. The first charge was broken and forced back with heavy losses. A second assault followed, led personally by Audley. It met the same wall of arrows and stubborn defence. During the fighting, Audley was killed, an event later marked on the battlefield itself. With his death, command passed to his deputy, and the approach changed. Much of the cavalry dismounted, and thousands advanced on foot toward the Yorkist position. The battle then became a grinding struggle at close quarters that dragged on into the afternoon, with neither side able to end it quickly. Watching the melee, the remaining mounted troops began to lose confidence. Seeing no clear victory and wary of being trapped, many of them left the field. That withdrawal removed the support the infantry needed. As pressure increased, the Lancastrian line started to buckle. Some men fell back, and a portion even switched sides in the confusion, joining Salisbury rather than dying for a collapsing cause. Once that tipping point was reached, the line broke and the fight became a rout. Losses on the Lancastrian side were severe, far heavier than those suffered by Salisbury's army. Later descriptions spoke of the nearby stream running red for days, the kind of image that often appears in battle memory, whether literally true or shaped by shock and storytelling. What cannot be doubted is that the Lancastrian nobles present paid a high price. Several knights were killed, and Dudley was captured during the retreat. As usual, victory created its own disorder. Pursuit and looting scattered the Yorkist soldiers, and in the darkness groups became separated from the main force. A number of prominent Yorkists chased fleeing enemies deep into unfamiliar country, and were later trapped near a bridge by local defenders who stayed behind to protect their homes. Those captured were taken to a nearby stronghold and held for months. The worst killing likely occurred during the rout, when dismounted men in heavy armour struggled to escape. Many were caught near a river crossing, unable to move quickly enough, and were cut down at a place that later generations remembered with a grim name. Queen Margaret was not on the battlefield, but she was close enough for rumours to follow her movements. Local tradition spoke of a hurried escape and a trick designed to confuse pursuers, the kind of story that thrives whenever powerful figures flee danger. Meanwhile, Salisbury, despite winning the day, remained in a precarious position. Two other royal armies still existed, and the larger strategic problem had not vanished. Even so, he managed to reach Ludlow and join York and Warwick, completing the link that Margaret had tried so hard to prevent. Stories later claim that cannon fire through the night helped mask Salisbury's movement and keep the enemy uncertain, and that a local friar offered an unusually cheerful explanation for why he kept firing. Whether literal fact or embellished anecdote, such tales reflect the tension of a withdrawal where one mistake could have been fatal. From Ludlow, the Yorkist leaders attempted to justify their actions to the king, framing themselves as loyal subjects forced into arms by bad governance and political persecution. The king replied with an offer of pardon to many who had rebelled, excluding those tied most closely to the bloodshed. Even combined, the Yorkist armies were still outmatched. Margaret had learned from past mistakes and was determined not to allow hesitation or divided command to hand the initiative to her enemies again. The royal host advanced and reached Ludford Bridge, where the Yorkists had taken up a fortified position. This time, the king's side had drawn in many peers and gathered overwhelming numbers, outnumbering York by a wide margin. The key element in York's strength was the contingent from Calais, seasoned soldiers under a commander named Andrew Trollope. Yet those men were still bound by an oath to the king, as part of the only official standing force England possessed at the time. When pardon and royal legitimacy were placed in front of them, they switched sides. The defection was a hammer blow. Trollope's experience also meant he understood Yorkist plans and the strengths and weaknesses of the position. With this change, York's situation became impossible to hold. As night fell, York and his closest allies withdrew under cover, claiming they were merely retiring for the evening. Instead, they gathered what they could and fled, leaving equipment and much of their army behind. Without leadership, the remaining Yorkist troops dispersed, and the royal side was free to punish a town seen as sympathetic to York. The Yorkist leaders scattered. York went to Ireland with one of his sons, where he still held influence and was welcomed by local supporters. Warwick, Salisbury, and York's heir made for Calais. In England, the Lancastrians moved quickly to strip York of official posts and replace them with their own men. A new captain was named for Calais and a new lieutenant appointed for Ireland. But titles on paper did not guarantee obedience. Ireland did not turn against York as easily as the Lancastrians hoped, and Calais proved even more stubborn. The garrison there remained loyal to Warwick, in part because his raids and trade had enriched them and made the city prosper. Somerset attempted to take the fortress by force, establishing a base nearby and launching repeated attacks, but the gates stayed shut. Money and supplies ran short, and calls went back to the king for help. Plans were made to build a fleet in southern England to carry an army across the Channel. Warwick learned of it quickly through his own network and struck first, raiding the port, destroying ships still under construction and seizing those already seaworthy. The shock of the raid spread fear along the southern coast. An invasion seemed possible at any moment. Warwick did not immediately land in force, but he did travel to Ireland to coordinate with York. And while he was away, the pressure on Calais increased again. The garrison held, and an attempt to bring supplies to Somerset ended badly when storms pushed a ship into Calais harbour and its passenger, Lord Audley, was arrested on arrival. In time, Audley changed sides, a reminder of how quickly loyalties could shift once captivity and survival entered the equation. By late spring, Warwick returned to Calais and struck southern England again, disrupting another attempt to build a fleet. A small force was left at Sandwich to serve as a foothold for what was now planned as a full return. Soon afterward, Warwick, Salisbury, and York's heir crossed with a few thousand men and began to march toward London. Along the way, support poured in, especially from regions where Warwick's name still carried weight. By the time he reached the capital, his army had swelled dramatically. The leading royal commander in the city withdrew into the Tower of London rather than resist inside the streets. Warwick did not plan a long stay. He left trusted men to contain the tower with a siege and prepared to move north before the king could consolidate his main army. Reports reached Warwick that the king was travelling towards safety, and part of the Yorkist force was sent to intercept him. Some of that intelligence appears to have been wrong at first. The king was actually marching south with the main Lancastrian army, moving slowly in hopes that northern reinforcements would arrive before a decisive battle. They did not reach him in time. Once Warwick confirmed the king's true position, he ordered his forces to reunite and march on Northampton, where Henry's army had taken up a defensive camp. Negotiations were attempted before the armies at Northampton finally clashed. Warwick hoped to reach the king directly and avoid a full battle, so he sent envoys led by the Bishop of Salisbury to speak with Henry. The message was simple. Warwick wished to present himself before the king and explain his cause, but the Lancastrian command would not allow it. The Duke of Buckingham, who controlled the royal army, refused to grant the bishop access to Henry and sent him back with a harsh warning that Warwick would not be permitted to approach the king and that any attempt to do so would end in his death. The chance for a peaceful settlement vanished at that moment. On the morning of July 10th, the Yorkist army began to advance toward the Lancastrian position along the road from Tewkesbury. The weather immediately complicated the movement. Heavy rain fell throughout the morning and continued in bursts during the day, turning the ground soft and slowing the advance. Even as the army approached, Warwick made 2 more attempts to negotiate. Heralds were sent forward again to request an audience with the king. Each time, they were turned away by the Lancastrian command. By the time the Yorkists deployed near Delaprey Abbey, facing the enemy across the wet fields, it was clear that words would accomplish nothing. The Yorkist army formed its lines with careful organisation. Lord Fauconberg held the left side of the formation and controlled the rear elements. Warwick commanded the central division, and the right wing was led by the young Earl of March, together with the Duke of Norfolk. The Lancastrian army waited behind prepared defences. Their position had been strengthened with a ditch filled with water drawn from the nearby river and reinforced with stakes planted along the line. Artillery had been positioned to fire on any approach, and the defenders believed the ground strongly favoured them. Warwick made one final effort before committing his army to the attack. A message was sent to Buckingham declaring that he intended to speak with the king that afternoon, and if he could not reach Henry peacefully, he would attempt it by force. The reply was once again a refusal. With that, Warwick ordered the assault. Trumpets sounded in the early afternoon, and the Yorkist army began its advance across the rain-soaked fields. The attack quickly proved difficult. The ground had become heavy and slippery, and the Yorkist troops struggled to maintain their formation while pushing forward. As they moved toward the defensive line, they were met with a fierce storm of arrows. Lancastrian archers fired continuously from behind their fortifications, forcing the attackers to halt and take cover. For a time, the Yorkists were unable to close the distance, and the strength of their defensive position seemed to give the advantage to the royal army. Yet the same weather that hindered the attackers also crippled the Lancastrians' greatest weapon. Their artillery, which might have devastated the advancing columns, became almost useless in the relentless rain. Wet powder and waterlogged equipment prevented the guns from firing effectively. What had appeared to be a powerful defensive line suddenly lost its most dangerous element. At the same time, an unexpected development shattered the Lancastrian defence. On the right flank of the royal position stood Sir Edmund Grey, commanding a portion of the line. As the Yorkists approached that sector, Grey ordered his men to lower their weapons and allow the attackers through the defences. Whether this decision had been arranged in advance or made in the moment, the result was catastrophic. For the Lancastrians, a gap opened in the line and Warwick's men poured through the breach. The Yorkists had been instructed to spare the lives of the king, ordinary soldiers, and anyone wearing the distinctive badge of Grey's household. All others were considered enemies. As Warwick and the Earl of March pushed through the opening, the Lancastrian position collapsed into confusion. The fortifications that had once provided protection now became a trap. Soldiers crowded together within the narrow defensive space, unable to manoeuvre as the Yorkists rolled along the line from one side to the other. The fighting after the breach was brief and brutal. Within half an hour the battle had effectively been decided. Several of the leading Lancastrian commanders attempted to defend the king's position, but were killed in the struggle. The Duke of Buckingham, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and other prominent nobles died while trying to hold back the advancing Yorkists. The surviving defenders broke apart and fled in disorder toward the nearby river. Compared with many battles of the period, the number of casualties was not enormous, but the losses among the Lancastrian leadership were severe. Many of the dead perished during the chaotic retreat rather than in the initial clash. Soldiers attempting to escape across the shallow river Nene were crushed, trampled, or drowned in the confusion as the defeated army scattered. Once the leading commanders had fallen and the king had been captured, resistance quickly ended. Henry VI once again found himself in the custody of his rivals. The Yorkist leaders surrounded his tent and secured control of the field. For the second time in the conflict, the king became a figure under the protection of the faction that had just defeated his own army. Warwick remained at Northampton for several days after the battle to secure the area before returning south with the king. When news of the victory reached London, it spread rapidly through the city. The remaining Lancastrian commander in the capital, Lord Scales, had been holding out inside the Tower of London while Warwick marched north. Once he learned that the royal army had been defeated and that no relief force would arrive, he opened negotiations. On July 19th, he agreed to surrender the tower in exchange for his life. His safety, however, proved short-lived. While attempting to escape by boat along the river at Westminster, he was attacked by local boatmen and killed. His body was later discovered near a church in Southwark, stripped and abandoned. Another death connected with the battle occurred almost by accident. A local knight, Sir William Lucy, rushed toward Northampton when he heard the sound of artillery. He intended to assist the king, but arrived just as the fighting ended. A Yorkist knight who recognised him as a personal rival seized the opportunity to strike him down. The killing was later rumoured to have been motivated by a private feud involving Lucy's wife, whom the attacker would later marry. The central factor behind the Yorkist victory remained the betrayal of Sir Edmund Grey. The speed with which Warwick's men were allowed through the defences suggests that the arrangement had likely been made in advance. The exact method by which the message was passed between the two sides remains unknown, but Grey's later career strongly hints at the rewards he received for his decision. In the years following the battle, he was granted high offices and new titles, rising to a powerful position within the Yorkist government. For the Lancastrians, the defeat at Northampton was as devastating as the Yorkists' earlier collapse at Ludford Bridge. The royal army had been broken, its commanders killed, and the king captured once again. Yet the struggle was far from finished. The Lancastrian cause still possessed a determined leader in Margaret of Anjou. Many supporters now looked to the Queen for direction and hoped she would rebuild the resistance in the months ahead. While Warwick returned to London with the king and began the work of governing the kingdom, the political situation remained unstable. He needed formal support to secure the new Yorkist authority, and therefore called for Parliament to meet later that summer. Even with Henry in Yorkist custody, the royal family was not fully under control. Margaret and her young son had escaped and travelled west, continuing to gather allies. Warwick soon turned his attention back to the fortress of Calais, whose garrison had waited anxiously for news after the Yorkist invasion of England. His return and the announcement of victory at Northampton restored confidence among the soldiers there. The Lancastrian commander, who had been attempting to take the fortress, realised that his position had become hopeless. Without support from England, and with Warwick now firmly in control, he negotiated terms that allowed him to withdraw in exchange for surrendering the surrounding positions and disbanding his army. Once that threat was removed, Warwick returned again to England. Rumours had already begun to circulate throughout London about the fate of the king. Some believed Henry had been killed, while others claimed that York or one of his sons would soon claim the crown. These stories gained strength because the Duke of York himself had remained in Ireland during much of the recent fighting. The speculation ended when York finally returned to England. He landed in the west and travelled gradually toward London, gathering supporters along the way. When he entered the capital, he made his intentions unmistakably clear. Trumpets sounded as he rode through the streets, his sword carried before him as a symbol of authority. At Westminster, he approached the throne itself and placed his hand upon it, signalling openly that he believed the crown should now be his. Instead of cheers, he was met with silence. The assembled nobles did not greet his claim with enthusiasm. After a tense moment, the Archbishop of Canterbury approached and asked a simple question: whether York wished to see the king. Without the support of the Lords, York could not seize the crown by force. Instead, he attempted to secure it through law. His claim to the throne had a strong legal basis, but his long absence in Ireland had weakened his standing. Many nobles also remembered the oath he had sworn years earlier not to harm Henry or take up arms against him again. These factors prevented the ruling elite from supporting a direct removal of the king. Parliament eventually sought a compromise. In October, an agreement was reached that allowed Henry to remain king for the rest of his life, but declared that the crown would pass to York and his heirs after Henry's death. The arrangement satisfied York and many of his supporters, but it was unacceptable to Queen Margaret. To her, the agreement stripped her own son of his rightful inheritance. Determined to resist, she began organising opposition in Wales, while seeking allies beyond England. Loyal Lancastrian commanders gathered troops and attempted to rebuild the royal cause in the north. Armies were raised, alliances revived, and scattered forces reunited. Reports soon reached the Yorkist government that a large Lancastrian host had assembled in the north of England. York responded by dividing his forces. His eldest son Edward was sent toward Wales to deal with Lancastrian resistance there. Warwick remained in London to secure the king and defend the south coast. York himself marched north, with an army of several thousand men to confront the growing threat. Although danger was approaching from the north, Warwick showed little urgency in leaving London. Reports suggested that Queen Margaret's army was only days away from the capital. Yet the Yorkist leadership spent valuable time consolidating their position. By the end of January, Warwick arranged for his brother, John Neville, to be elevated to the title of Lord Montague. At the same time, in a display of ceremony and prestige, Warwick named himself, along with Sir John Wenlock, Lord Bonville, and Sir Thomas Kyriel, to the prestigious Order of the Garter. The gestures were both political and symbolic, reinforcing the authority of the Yorkist leadership, while the kingdom stood on the edge of another major confrontation. At last, on 12th February, Warwick marched out of London. The force he commanded was enormous by the standards of the time, perhaps 25,000 soldiers. Among the most prominent supporters marching with him were the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Suffolk. The Yorkist ranks also included experienced commanders such as Montague, Fauconberg, Bonville, Berners, Wenlock, and Captain Lovelace. Even foreign support had arrived. The Duke of Burgundy had sent a group of handgunners equipped with early firearms to assist the Yorkist cause, a rare sight in English warfare at that time. Facing them was an army of similar size gathering under the Lancastrian banner. Queen Margaret and her young son, Prince Edward, travelled with the host, though the army itself was directed by the Duke of Somerset. Its numbers were difficult to calculate precisely. Many of the soldiers were irregular fighters drawn from different regions and loyalties, yet the army was still formidable. Among its commanders were the Earl of Northumberland, the Duke of Exeter, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and several other powerful lords. Their forces moved south slowly, carrying the symbol of the Prince of Wales, the white ostrich feather, as their emblem. As the Lancastrian army reached Royston, it suddenly turned west toward Dunstable, instead of continuing directly south. The reason for this manoeuvre has never been entirely clear. It may have been an attempt to gain a stronger position against Warwick, or perhaps a move intended to surprise the Yorkists by approaching from an unexpected direction. Warwick himself reached St Albans on the 13th of February, but uncertainty remained about the exact location of the Lancastrian army. Reports of enemy movements continued to arrive from different directions, many of them likely describing small groups of undisciplined soldiers roaming the countryside rather than the main force itself. Because of this confusion, Warwick decided to adopt a defensive strategy. His army spread out across a wide line roughly 2 miles long north of St Albans, covering the major roads leading south toward London. The arrangement placed different sections of the Yorkist army at several points along the countryside. Warwick himself commanded the central reserve, positioned further north of the town. Montague held the left side of the line, with part of his troops stationed inside St Albans and the remainder on nearby high ground. The right wing stood farther north under the Duke of Norfolk. The extended formation seemed strong on paper but had one serious weakness. Communication between the different sections was extremely difficult. Narrow country lanes and thick hedgerows made it hard for messengers to travel quickly between commanders. During the following days, Warwick focused on strengthening the position. Defences were prepared along the expected routes of attack, and a variety of obstacles were placed to slow any advance. Among the Yorkist forces were the Burgundian handgunners, whose weapons could fire metal bolts or small lead projectiles. Though primitive, these weapons represented a new development in warfare and were rarely seen on English battlefields. Additional defensive measures were constructed across the landscape. Heavy nets covered with upward-pointing spikes were stretched across gaps in the hedgerows. Anyone attempting to cross them risked severe injury. Archers were protected behind specially designed barricades with movable panels that allowed them to fire arrows while remaining shielded from return fire. The ground itself was scattered with caltraps, small iron devices designed so that one spike always pointed upward regardless of how they landed. These were capable of crippling both horses and men who stepped upon them. Despite these preparations, Warwick still lacked reliable information about the enemy's position. Scouts sent out to locate the Lancastrian army failed to find it. Believing the opposing force to be farther away than it actually was, Warwick remained in his defensive line and waited. Late in the evening of the 16th of February, disturbing news reached the Yorkist camp. An outpost stationed at Dunstable, commanded by Sir Edward Poynings, had been attacked earlier that day. The report claimed that the entire detachment had been wiped out or captured. Warwick dismissed the news as unreliable. Convinced that the main Lancastrian army was still several miles away, he chose not to alter his plans. This decision would soon prove disastrous. The information about the attack was entirely accurate. After overwhelming the outpost at Dunstable, Queen Margaret's army paused briefly before beginning a rapid night march towards St. Albans. Travelling along the old Roman road, the soldiers covered roughly 12 miles in darkness. By early morning on the 17th of February, they reached the outskirts of the town near the Church of St. Michael. Following a short rest, the Lancastrian commanders organised their approach. The vanguard, led by the experienced soldier Andrew Trollope, moved quietly down George Street and entered St. Albans. Their arrival caught the Yorkists completely off guard. The town gates had not been closed, and the entrances were poorly guarded. Lancastrian troops pushed straight into the streets and reached the market square before encountering resistance. Yorkist archers stationed inside the town quickly reacted. Though surprised, they fought fiercely within the narrow streets and managed to halt the Lancastrian advance. In the confined space, the archers drove the attackers back along the same route they had entered. The first assault had been repelled, but the situation had suddenly become extremely dangerous for Warwick's army. The unexpected appearance of the Lancastrians created confusion among the Yorkist commanders. Their defensive line faced north, yet the enemy had appeared from the west. Units now had to reposition quickly in order to confront the threat. Montague's troops on Barnard's Heath were among the first to react. He pulled his men out of their prepared defences and formed a new line, facing toward the town. Meanwhile, the Lancastrian commanders regrouped near St. Michael's Church. Realising that the town could not be taken through the same narrow route, they sent scouts to search for alternative entrances. The scouts soon returned with valuable information. Another lane leading into the town had been left unguarded. Somerset immediately ordered a new attack. This time, the assault came from two directions. Lancastrian forces advanced through both George Street and Catherine Lane in an attempt to trap the defenders. The Yorkist archers gathered in the market square fought with determination but were gradually overwhelmed by the larger attacking force. Once resistance inside the town collapsed, the Lancastrians secured control of St. Albans. The capture of the town marked the first stage of Margaret's strategy. The soldiers had marched through the night and fought 2 engagements already that morning, so the army paused to reorganise and rest. By midday, the Lancastrian forces were prepared to launch a full attack against the main Yorkist positions outside the town. Montague's troops now formed the front line on Barnet's Heath, facing the advancing Lancastrian army. Realising that the entire enemy force was approaching his position, Montague urgently sent messengers to Warwick, requesting reinforcements from the Central Reserve. But the same terrain that had once protected the Yorkists now worked against them. Thick hedgerows and winding lanes delayed the messengers, and valuable time was lost before Warwick even received the message. Shortly after noon, the Lancastrian army advanced toward Montague's line. The Yorkist soldiers fought stubbornly, resisting the attack for several hours. But the difference in numbers gradually began to tell. Step by step, the Lancastrians pushed the defenders back down the slopes toward the open ground of Barnard's Heath. It was not until early afternoon that Warwick finally learned what had happened in St Albans. He immediately ordered his forces to move toward the battle. But the narrow roads once again slowed their progress. Determined to reach the fight as quickly as possible, Warwick left the infantry behind and charged forward with his cavalry across the countryside. By the time he arrived, the situation had already deteriorated. Montague's exhausted soldiers had been fighting alone for hours, desperately hoping for reinforcements that never came. Then, the situation grew even worse. Captain Lovelace, who commanded a contingent of troops from Kent, suddenly switched allegiance and joined the Lancastrian side. The loss of these men shattered the remaining confidence of the Yorkist line. Montague's army finally broke. When Warwick reached the battlefield, he found the left wing already collapsing, and his brother taken prisoner. Lancastrian forces were now advancing toward him across the heath. Though scattered pockets of Yorkist resistance still remained, Warwick understood that the battle had been lost. He ordered his cavalry to withdraw and return toward his infantry. His plan was to regroup the remaining forces and attempt to form a defensive line further back. But by evening, the damage had already been done. News of the earlier defeats had spread through the Yorkist ranks, and many soldiers began slipping away into the darkness as night approached. Warwick managed to gather some troops and maintain a small organised force, but the majority of the army had already dispersed. Facing a stronger enemy and declining morale among his men, he chose to withdraw from the battlefield, rather than risk total destruction the following day. The losses were severe. Around 4,000 Yorkists were killed during the fighting, while Lancastrian casualties were roughly half that number. For Warwick, the defeat carried a deeper significance. Until that day, he had never lost a major battle. As night fell, the pursuit of fleeing Yorkists continued across the countryside. During the chaos, King Henry, who had accompanied the Yorkist army during the campaign, was discovered sitting quietly beneath a tree. Abandoned by most of his guards, he had remained with only 2 loyal companions who stayed beside him after receiving assurances of safety. The Lancastrians quickly escorted him to the abbey, where he was reunited with Queen Margaret and their son. In celebration of the victory, Henry formally knighted the young prince. The prince in turn knighted Andrew Trollope and several other soldiers who had distinguished themselves during the battle. Soon afterward, the captured Yorkist leaders were brought forward. Despite earlier promises of mercy, Lord Bonville and Sir Thomas Kyriel were condemned to death on the orders of Queen Margaret and executed immediately. Montague's life, however, was spared. The Lancastrian leadership feared retaliation against one of their own relatives who was being held by the Yorkists in Calais. As a result, Montague was sent north as a prisoner rather than executed. The victory quickly descended into chaos. The town of St Albans was looted by soldiers within the Lancastrian army, many of them foreign mercenaries who had little discipline. When local leaders begged the king to stop the destruction, he proved powerless to control the situation. Real authority in the army lay with Queen Margaret and the Duke of Somerset, while Andrew Trollope acted as a key advisor in military matters. The events surrounding the battle later sparked debate, particularly regarding Lovelace's sudden change of sides. Some accounts suggested that he had been captured earlier and forced to betray Warwick's plans in exchange for his life. Others believed the story was created later to explain Warwick's mistakes during the campaign. Whatever the truth, the collapse of communication and the surprise attack from an unexpected direction played decisive roles in the Yorkist defeat. Despite rumours that Warwick fled the battlefield to save himself, his actions likely reflected an attempt to reorganise his scattered forces rather than abandon them. The failure of most of the Yorkist army to even reach the fighting suggests how badly the command structure had broken down. During the late summer, while King Edward IV focused his attention on securing the south of England and stabilising Wales, the situation in the north was being handled by two of his most capable allies, the Earl of Warwick and his brother, Lord Montague. Throughout August and September, they moved steadily across Northumberland, confronting and dismantling scattered pockets of Lancastrian resistance that still lingered after earlier conflicts. Edward had already strengthened Warwick's authority by granting him the position of Warden General of both the East and West Marches at the end of July. This appointment formally recognised Warwick's power in the northern borderlands and allowed him to raise troops, command local forces, and direct the military resources of the region in the King's name. By the close of September, one of the most important Lancastrian strongholds in the north, Alnwick Castle, surrendered to Warwick. After securing the fortress, he installed a garrison of 100 loyal men-at-arms to maintain Yorkist control. Shortly afterward, in early October, the powerful coastal fortress of Dunstanburgh also passed into Warwick's hands when Sir Ralph Percy personally delivered it to him. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Yorkist struggle to dominate northern England was nearing its conclusion. Yet this promising success soon began to unravel because of a decision made by Edward himself. After Dunstanburgh had fallen, the king instructed Warwick to leave Sir Ralph Percy in charge of the castle as its constable. The choice proved disastrous. Not long afterward, a raiding force operating out of Scotland, commanded by Sir William Taleboys, managed to seize Alnwick Castle once again. From there, the raiders marched to Dunstanburgh. Percy, who had already changed loyalties before, abandoned his new allegiance and opened the gates to them. At the same time, another incursion into northern England, led by Lord Humphrey Dacre, succeeded in capturing Naworth Castle near Carlisle. These events quickly demonstrated that Yorkist control in the north remained fragile and that the Lancastrian cause was far from extinguished. The Yorkist leadership soon realised that as long as the Lancastrians could operate from bases inside Scotland, the rebellion in Northumberland would never be completely eliminated. Military victories alone were not enough. With this in mind, Warwick attempted a diplomatic solution and arranged a meeting with Mary of Guelders, the Queen Regent of Scotland. During the discussions, Warwick received a certain amount of sympathy from Mary, and from several younger members of the Scottish political elite. However, the more conservative faction known as the Old Lords refused to support any position favourable to Edward. Their opposition was strongly influenced by Queen Margaret of Anjou, whose presence in Scotland encouraged resistance to the Yorkist government. The meeting, therefore, achieved very little beyond an agreement to continue discussions at a later date. Between the diplomatic talks, Warwick increased pressure on Scotland by organising additional raids across the border, hoping to force the Scottish Regency Council into reconsidering its stance. At the same time, Edward appealed to Philip, Duke of Burgundy, a powerful ally and the uncle of Mary of Guelders, asking him to encourage a more cooperative Scottish policy. Faced with growing political pressure, Mary sought a temporary pause in the conflict. When Queen Margaret requested financial assistance to travel to France in order to seek diplomatic support for her husband Henry VI, Mary readily agreed. Her hope was that Margaret's absence might weaken the influence of the hard-line faction in Scotland and open the door to negotiations with the Yorkists. Without Margaret present to encourage resistance, and with Scotland facing internal difficulties of its own, the Regency Council became more willing to compromise. The result was a temporary non-aggression agreement between England and Scotland, intended to last from June until the end of August, in the year 1462. With the truce approaching, Edward immediately ordered reinforcements northward to confront the remaining Lancastrian forces. By the middle of July, Lord Dacre surrendered his troops at Naworth to Lord Montague. At roughly the same time, Sir William Taleboys, who had once again taken control of Alnwick Castle during the previous winter, surrendered after a short siege to a Yorkist force commanded by Lord Hastings, Sir John Howard, and Sir Ralph Grey. Meanwhile, Bamburgh Castle, another important stronghold in the region, was captured for the Yorkists by Sir William Turnstall. While these events unfolded in England, Queen Margaret was pursuing her own diplomatic efforts in France. She reached an agreement with King Louis XI in June, in which she promised that the strategic port of Calais would be handed over to the French crown if her cause succeeded. In exchange, Louis agreed to provide financial assistance and to send a capable military commander, Pierre de Brézé, along with a contingent of French soldiers. Soon afterward, Margaret, de Brézé, and approximately 800 men-at-arms sailed for the British Isles. Their first destination was Scotland, where Henry VI joined them. From there, the small expedition sailed south along the coast and landed near Bamburgh on the 25th of October. The castle opened its gates to the Queen's forces, and the command of the garrison was entrusted to the Duke of Somerset. With Sir Ralph Percy still holding Dunstanburgh for the Lancastrian cause, Margaret was able to focus her attention on Alnwick Castle. The Yorkist garrison there had been cut off from supplies, and before long it was forced to surrender to her army. The Yorkists reacted quickly. Only 5 days after Margaret's landing, Warwick set out from London and headed north. Soon afterward, King Edward himself followed with a massive army composed of many of the leading nobles of Yorkist England. By the time the royal army reached York, the king was accompanied by 2 dukes, 7 earls, more than 30 barons, and dozens of knights, along with an enormous force said to number more than 40,000 soldiers. Faced with such overwhelming strength, and aware that her cause had failed to attract widespread support, even after raising Henry's royal banner at Bamburgh, Margaret decided to withdraw. She fled back towards Scotland, together with her husband Henry VI. Before departing, she promised that she would one day return with an army strong enough to challenge Edward and relieve the castles of Dunstanburgh, Bamburgh, and Alnwick, which she left defended by loyal garrisons prepared to resist the Yorkist advance. As Edward marched north, he reached the city of Durham on the 16th of November. But his campaign was suddenly interrupted when he fell seriously ill with measles. Confined to bed and unable to lead his army personally, he entrusted command of the upcoming operations to the Earl of Warwick. Meanwhile, Margaret faced her own misfortune. After leaving Bamburgh on the 13th of November, her small fleet of 4 ships encountered a violent winter storm in the North Sea. Her vessel was wrecked, and she, Henry VI, and Pierre de Brézé narrowly escaped death when a local fisherman rescued them and carried them safely to the Scottish port of Berwick. The soldiers who had accompanied them were far less fortunate. Forced to land on Holy Island at Lindisfarne, many of them were killed or captured by the local population. By early December, Warwick had gathered his forces and organised a coordinated campaign against the remaining Lancastrian strongholds. Sieges were laid simultaneously against Alnwick, Bamburgh, and Dunstanburgh. Lord Montague commanded the army surrounding Bamburgh, where the defenders were led by the Duke of Somerset. Supporting Montague were several experienced nobles, including Lords Ogle, Strange, and Say. The siege of Alnwick was entrusted to another group of commanders, including Lord Fauconberg, who had recently become Earl of Kent, together with Lord Scales, the Earl of Worcester, and Sir John Tiptoft. Dunstanburgh, defended by Sir Ralph Percy, was left to a separate force commanded by Lords Scrope, Greystoke, and Powis. The entire campaign was directed by Warwick himself. From his headquarters at Warkworth Castle, where a reserve army of roughly 7,000 men remained ready for action, he moved constantly between the different siege operations, coordinating strategy and distributing supplies wherever they were needed. These supplies arrived daily in Newcastle, transported both by sea and by road, and were then forwarded to the besieging armies under the supervision of the newly appointed Duke of Norfolk, John Mowbray. The efficiency of this logistical network demonstrated how much Warwick had improved as a military organiser since earlier setbacks in the wars. The result soon became clear. The defenders of Bamburgh Castle were the first to surrender when the Duke of Somerset negotiated terms. On December 26th, the soldiers inside the fortress were allowed to depart peacefully, though they were required to leave their weapons behind. 2 days later, the garrison of Dunstanburgh followed the same path. Ordinary soldiers were pardoned after swearing loyalty to Edward, but the leading commanders, including Percy and Somerset, were taken to Durham to appear before the king. With these two fortresses secured, Warwick could finally concentrate his attention on Alnwick and on reports that a Scottish relief army, led by Pierre de Brezé and the Earl of Angus, was approaching from the north. The Scottish force appeared before Alnwick on the 5th of January. Although Warwick had received warning of its movement, the speed of its arrival surprised him, and he ordered a sudden withdrawal from his prepared positions. Suspicious of a possible trap, the Scottish commanders halted their army below the castle instead of pursuing. At that moment, the garrison of Alnwick seized the opportunity to abandon the fortress and join their allies outside. Once united, the combined Scottish and Lancastrian army withdrew toward the border. The following morning, Warwick reoccupied the empty castle without resistance. With this development, Edward effectively secured control over the northern frontier, as every major fortress in Northumberland had now fallen into Yorkist hands. Even so, Edward's habit of trusting former enemies would once again create problems. Percy was pardoned and allowed to return to his lands after swearing loyalty, and he was even restored to positions of authority in the northern castles. The Duke of Somerset also regained the king's favour for a time, travelling alongside Edward and Warwick, when they later returned south for the ceremonial reburial of Edward's father, the Duke of York, and Warwick's father, the Earl of Salisbury. Yet these gestures of reconciliation would not end the long struggle between the rival factions. Early in the following year, Queen Margaret crossed the border into England once again, with renewed determination. Sir Ralph Percy soon returned to the Lancastrian side for the second time and handed over the castles of Bamburgh and Dunstanburgh. Not long afterwards, Sir Ralph Grey also changed allegiance and opened the gates of Alnwick to Lancastrian forces. These betrayals showed that the struggle for the north was not yet finished, and that the conflict between York and Lancaster would continue to reshape England for years to come. On the morning of May 15th, the Yorkist army advanced along the road past Bywell as it moved toward Hexham. Whether anyone from King Henry VI's small household noticed the approaching army and attempted to warn the Lancastrian forces remains uncertain. What is known is that the Lancastrians were saved from complete surprise only because their scouts detected the Yorkist advance. As Somerset's soldiers were beginning to stir in their camp near the Linnels, the alarm spread through the ranks, giving them just enough time to prepare for the battle that was about to unfold. Precise details of the fighting are limited, as surviving records offer only fragments of information. Somerset, alerted by his scouts, quickly gathered his troops and organised them into battle formation before the Yorkists reached their camp. The sudden nature of the threat left him with little opportunity to select a more favourable position. Instead, he was forced to arrange his army on a stretch of flat ground at the base of a hill where Lord Montague's Yorkist forces had already taken position above him. Somerset's army formed its line with the River Devil's water behind them, an unfortunate placement that would soon prove disastrous. Somerset himself commanded the centre of the Lancastrian formation. On one side stood the forces of Lords Roos and Hungerford, while the opposite flank was led by Lords Grey and Neville. Above them on the ridge, the Yorkist army assembled in response. Lord Montague commanded the centre of the Yorkist line and held the strongest concentration of troops. On his flanks were the forces of Lords Willoughby and Greystoke. Montague understood the fragile loyalties that surrounded him, especially since some of the men fighting beside him had once served the Lancastrian cause. Remembering earlier battles where sudden betrayals had turned victory into disaster, he chose to command the main body of his army personally. The engagement began early in the morning when Montague decided to act without hesitation. His centre surged forward in a rapid downhill assault, charging directly into the Lancastrian ranks. The two armies collided in brutal hand-to-hand combat as Montague's soldiers crashed into the centre of Somerset's formation. The Lancastrians initially resisted the impact of the attack, but the pressure of the downhill charge forced them backward. Even a small retreat proved catastrophic. With the river already behind them, Somerset's soldiers had nowhere to fall back. The ground beneath them quickly became a trap. As the front ranks struggled to hold their position, confusion spread through the Lancastrian line. Soldiers attempting to retreat were pushed toward the riverbank by the pressure of men behind them. Many lost their footing and fell into the water, drowning under the weight of their armour. Others clung desperately to the edge of the bank, only to be crushed by the bodies of their own comrades as the formation collapsed in chaos. Montague's initial charge was soon reinforced by the rest of the Yorkist army advancing down the hillside. With the full weight of the Yorkist force now engaged, the fighting extended across the entire Lancastrian line. The struggle was intense but brief. Somerset attempted to rally his troops and restore order within the shattered centre. For a short time he managed to organise resistance on one side of his line. But when he turned to coordinate the other flank, he discovered that Lords Roos and Hungerford had already abandoned the field, repeating the same pattern seen in earlier fighting. Using the nearby ford as an escape route, they withdrew along with many of their soldiers. With one flank gone and the centre already broken, the remaining Lancastrian troops lost what little cohesion they still possessed. The left flank soon collapsed as well. Sir Ralph Grey and Sir Humphrey Neville, along with other commanders, fled as the Yorkist soldiers pressed forward. The retreat quickly turned into a desperate flight for survival as the Lancastrians attempted to escape toward Hexham, pursued relentlessly by the victorious Yorkist forces. The battle ended with the complete destruction of Somerset's army. The remaining Lancastrian soldiers, many of them the Duke's personal retainers, were overwhelmed. Somerset himself was captured alive on the field. Tewkesbury. The aftermath of the battle was swift and severe. The following day, the Duke of Somerset was executed in the presence of Lord Montague. Lords Roos and Hungerford, who had attempted to hide in nearby woodland after their escape, were captured and taken to Newcastle. 2 days later, they too were executed. Somerset's death marked a dramatic fall for a man whose family had once stood among the most powerful supporters of King Henry VI. Yet his fate had long seemed inevitable. Years earlier, he had commanded the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Wakefield, where the fathers and brothers of many Yorkist leaders had been killed. Those memories had never been forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the Yorkist commanders continued their efforts to destroy the remaining Lancastrian resistance. By mid-July, more than 24 Lancastrian supporters had been captured and executed under the authority of Montague and his brother, the Earl of Warwick, who had now joined the campaign in the north. Their treatment of captured enemies was far harsher than that of King Edward, who had often preferred reconciliation. Another significant capture soon followed. Sir William Taleboys, a prominent Lancastrian supporter, was discovered hiding inside a coal pit along with a large sum of money belonging to King Henry's war treasury. He was taken to Newcastle and executed shortly afterward. After the victory at Hexham, Montague learned that King Henry VI had recently been staying at Bywell Castle. Hoping to capture him, he immediately dispatched soldiers to search the estate. But Henry had already fled before they arrived. When the Yorkist troops entered the chamber where the king had spent the night, they found only a few abandoned garments and his ceremonial helmet, left behind in the hurried escape. Montague's success in the northern campaigns did not go unrewarded. Only 2 weeks after the battle, he was honoured in the city of York before a large gathering of nobles, including his brothers Richard, Earl of Warwick, and George, Bishop of Exeter. There, King Edward granted him the prestigious title of Earl of Northumberland, a position that brought both influence and considerable wealth. The defeat of the Lancastrian army at Hexham effectively ended organised Lancastrian resistance in Northumberland. Only a few fortified castles still remained outside Yorkist control. These included Alnwick, Dunstanburgh, and Bamburgh, each of them sheltering survivors from the defeated armies. The Yorkist advance continued toward Alnwick first. Inside its walls were many soldiers who had already experienced defeat in previous battles and had little desire to continue the struggle. When Warwick's herald approached the castle and offered generous surrender terms, including a full pardon for the defenders, the garrison accepted. On 23rd June, the Yorkist army entered and took control of the fortress. Dunstanburgh followed soon afterward. Offered the same conditions, its defenders surrendered without resistance only 2 days later. Bamburgh Castle remained the final Lancastrian stronghold in England. Warwick once again attempted negotiation, sending a herald to offer the king's pardon to those inside, if they surrendered immediately. Most of the garrison likely would have accepted, but their commander was Sir Ralph Grey, who had changed sides multiple times during the conflict. Because he and Sir Humphrey Neville were specifically excluded from the offer of pardon, Grey refused to surrender. When the herald returned to the castle with a second appeal, he also carried a personal warning from Warwick. The message made it clear that the siege would continue for as long as necessary. Grey, fully aware that surrender would likely lead to his execution, chose to remain and fight. The siege that followed became one of the few major artillery sieges during the entire conflict. Large royal cannons were brought forward and positioned around the fortress. As the bombardment began, the walls of Bamburgh slowly started to crumble under the repeated impact of heavy gunfire. During one attack, a cannonball struck the building that housed Grey's chamber, shattering the structure and knocking him unconscious beneath falling debris. With their commander severely injured and unable to continue the defence, the garrison's second-in-command began negotiations. A ceasefire was arranged, and terms were accepted that allowed the remaining defenders to surrender in exchange for their lives. The gates of Bamburgh were opened and the Yorkist army entered the fortress. Sir Ralph Grey, badly wounded, was taken south to Doncaster. There, he was tried for treason and sentenced to death. On July 10th, he was executed By the end of the summer of 1464, Edward IV could claim effective control over nearly all of England and Wales. Only one major Lancastrian stronghold still resisted him, Harlech Castle in Wales, which would continue to hold out for several more years. For a time, the country entered a period of relative stability. The long and bitter struggles that had begun nearly a decade earlier seemed finally to be reaching an end. From the first clash at St Albans in 1455 to the fall of Bamburgh Castle in 1464, years of conflict had reshaped the kingdom. King Henry VI, however, remained free for a short while longer. For almost a year he wandered through northern England before finally being captured in a woodland near the town of Clitheroe in Lancashire. At the time he was accompanied only by a small group of attendants. After his capture he was taken to the Tower of London, where he lived quietly in confinement. The brief period in which Edward IV was under restraint soon proved enough for him to regain control of events. Determined to restore his authority, he called for several of the most powerful nobles still loyal to him. Among those summoned were his brother Richard, along with the Earls of Arundel, Essex, and Northumberland, as well as William, Lord Hastings, and other members of the Royal Council. They were instructed to leave London and come directly into the king's presence. Once these men had gathered around him, Edward made it clear that he intended to reclaim his position fully. Surrounded by supporters once more, he declared that he would return to London. In the middle of October, he entered the capital with all the ceremony and confidence expected of a reigning monarch. The Earl of Warwick attempted to associate the Neville family with the king's return in order to maintain some influence. He instructed his brother, Archbishop George Neville, to accompany Edward as he entered the city. Yet the king had no intention of sharing the moment. As the Archbishop and the Earl of Oxford hurried to catch up with the royal procession, a messenger from Edward intercepted them. The message was brief and unmistakable. If the king required their presence, he would send for them. The signal was clear. Warwick's dominance over English politics had come to an abrupt end. Edward had reclaimed both his independence and his throne. Warwick's inability to hold power had stemmed largely from a lack of support among the leading nobles of the realm, although many disliked Edward personally and criticised his rule. He was still the legitimate king. The uprising that had supported Warwick's cause the previous year had been motivated primarily by resentment towards certain royal advisers, particularly members of the Woodville and Herbert families. It had never been intended as a movement to depose Edward himself. Replacing the king was a far more radical step, and one that few were prepared to support openly. Warwick soon realised that governing England without the king's authority was impossible. For that reason, Edward had eventually been allowed to resume his freedom. Yet the situation remained unstable. Just as Warwick could not rule the country without Edward, the king would soon discover that ruling without Warwick also carried serious difficulties. An uneasy calm settled over the kingdom. Edward was careful not to provoke further conflict with the powerful Earl. Nevertheless, he began quietly reshaping the balance of power. The death of the Earl of Pembroke had created a political vacuum in Wales. Warwick had attempted to claim several influential positions there for himself during the previous year. Edward now removed those titles from him and reassigned them to his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The events of 1469 had not produced the outcome Warwick had hoped for. Although he had succeeded in removing some of Edward's most influential advisers, he had not gained the level of control he desired. His daughter's marriage to the Duke of Clarence had brought his family closer to the royal line of succession, but it still left him dissatisfied. His earlier attempt to dominate the government with Edward as a figurehead had clearly failed. Outwardly, the king behaved as though the conflict had been resolved. but Warwick understood that Edward had not forgotten the humiliation of his captivity. The king was simply waiting for the right moment to strike back. From Warwick's perspective, only one decisive move could secure his ambitions. If Edward were removed before producing a male heir, the crown would eventually pass to Clarence. As Clarence's father-in-law, Warwick would then stand in a position of enormous influence. Under such an arrangement, the government of England could effectively be shaped according to Warwick's wishes. For this plan to succeed, however, the kingdom first needed to fall into turmoil again. As long as peace endured, there would be no opportunity to act. Warwick understood that England's fragile stability would not last forever. He simply waited for the moment when conflict would return. That moment arrived early in March 1470. The immediate cause was a local dispute in Lincolnshire between Sir Thomas Burr of Gainsborough and a powerful landowner, Richard, Lord Wells. During the winter, Wells and several relatives had led a group of armed men to attack Burr's manor house. They forced Burr's family to flee the region and seized the property and goods they found there. Burr held the position of Master of the Horse in Edward's household, making him a royal official. When news of the attack reached the king, Edward decided to intervene directly. Lord Wells and Sir Thomas Dimmock were summoned to appear before him at Westminster. Although both men arrived promptly and were formally pardoned for their actions, Edward ordered that they remain in London under royal supervision. This sudden intervention alarmed those members of the Wells family who remained in Lincolnshire. Sir Robert Wells, the son of Lord Wells, feared that harsher measures might follow. Seeking powerful allies, he turned to the Earl of Warwick, who happened to be related to his family. Warwick and Clarence saw the opportunity immediately. They agreed to assist Wells and encourage preparations for resistance. Warwick allowed Clarence to handle much of the planning, hoping to strengthen the Duke's standing among potential supporters. Clarence sent a trusted chaplain into Lincolnshire with instructions that Wells should gather his followers but avoid open action until Warwick had left London. Meanwhile, Edward ordered a royal army to assemble at Grantham on 12th March. This time, the king had no intention of repeating the mistakes of the previous year. He prepared to leave London on the 4th of March, accompanied by several leading nobles, including the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk and a number of trusted commanders. Just as he was preparing to depart, he received word that Clarence had arrived in the city and wished to speak with him. The brothers met at Baynard's castle 2 days later. If Edward suspected anything unusual about Clarence's visit, he gave no indication. Clarence explained that he intended to travel west to visit his wife and would not be accompanying the royal expedition. Only after Edward had left London did the true purpose of Clarence's visit become clear. His presence had been intended to delay the king's departure long enough for Sir Robert Wells to complete his preparations. Once Edward was on the road, Clarence quickly left the city and rode to join Warwick. Rumours soon spread across Lincolnshire that the king intended to punish the region severely for earlier rebellions. Stories circulated that royal judges would soon arrive to execute large numbers of common people. Whether these rumours were exaggerated or deliberately spread, they had the desired effect. Fear and anger began to spread throughout the countryside. Sir Robert Wells stepped forward as a leader of the local resistance. Notices calling for armed support were posted in churches across Lincolnshire, urging men to gather and defend themselves against the king's forces. The chosen meeting place was Ranby Hall, near Lincoln. Edward learned of these developments while travelling through eastern England. Reports soon reached him that a large rebel force was forming and that men from neighbouring counties were joining the movement. Estimates claimed that tens of thousands of armed men were gathering. At the same time, Edward received letters from Warwick and Clarence announcing that they intended to join him with their own forces to help suppress the rebellion. Although the king found this offer surprising, he had not yet uncovered their involvement in the uprising. He therefore issued official commissions allowing them to raise troops in the king's name. As Edward advanced northward, he ordered Lord Wells and Sir Thomas Dimmock to be brought from London to his camp. When questioned separately, both men admitted their role in the earlier conflict but denied that Warwick or Clarence were involved. Edward then ordered Lord Wells to write a letter to his son instructing him to surrender immediately. The message also warned that failure to comply would lead to the execution of his father and Dimmock. Soon afterward, Edward received intelligence that the rebel army had changed direction and was moving toward Leicester. At the same time, Warwick and Clarence were also reported to be heading in the same direction. The king began to suspect that the rebel force and Warwick's army were attempting to unite. If that happened, Edward could find himself trapped between two enemy armies. Recognizing the danger, he adjusted his plans and moved quickly towards Stamford. Sir Robert Wells, upon receiving his father's letter, turned his army back towards Stamford in the hope of saving his father's life. Edward's own army arrived in the area at roughly the same time. As the king's forces prepared for battle, he ordered that Lord Wells and Sir Thomas Dimmock be executed before the assembled troops. The rebel army advanced soon afterward. Their force consisted largely of infantry led by captains who shouted the names of Warwick and Clarence as battle cries, confirming Edward's suspicions about the conspiracy behind the revolt. Despite their numbers, the rebels were poorly trained compared with the royal troops. Edward opened the battle with artillery fire before ordering a full attack. The rebel formation collapsed almost immediately. Many of the men broke and fled before the armies even came into close combat. As the rebels ran, many threw away the livery jackets they wore, bearing the colours of Warwick and Clarence, hoping to avoid punishment if captured. Because so many garments were discarded during the retreat, the confrontation later became known as the Battle of Losecote Field. Several rebel leaders were captured after the fighting ended, including Sir Robert Wells and other commanders. One prisoner carried letters from Clarence that clearly revealed the involvement of both the Duke and Warwick in organising the rebellion. For Edward, the discovery confirmed that the threat he had faced had been far greater than it first appeared. Had Warwick's professional soldiers joined the rebels before the battle, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, Edward had secured a decisive victory. Shortly afterward, the king sent letters ordering Warwick and Clarence to disband their forces and appear before him with only a small retinue. At the same time, he instructed other loyal commanders in the north to deal with remaining rebel groups that had failed to reach the battlefield. Warwick and Clarence, realizing the danger they now faced, hesitated. Their forces were too small to confront the king directly. They pretended to agree with Edward's demands, but secretly continued gathering supporters, while moving northward. Edward soon realized that they had no intention of obeying his commands. He declared them traitors and called upon their followers to abandon them. Support for Warwick quickly began to collapse. Several nobles who had initially sided with him changed their allegiance once the scale of the conspiracy became clear. The king's army continued to grow while Warwick's position weakened. Recognizing that victory was impossible, Warwick and Clarence abandoned their attempt to seize power. They retreated westward, eventually reaching the coast where ships were waiting. Edward's return to England did not go unnoticed. News of his advance spread quickly, and the Lancastrian leadership began gathering their own forces to confront him. When Edward reached Nottingham, he received word that a powerful Lancastrian army had assembled at Newark. The force was led by John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, together with Lord Beaumont and the Duke of Exeter. Rather than avoid them, Edward turned his army toward Newark, intending to force a decisive engagement. Yet during the night of 24th March, new information reached the Yorkist camp. The Lancastrian commanders, having learned of Edward's rapid approach, had lost confidence and withdrawn southward instead. Their goal was to unite with Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who had already marched out from London and was gathering men across Warwickshire to oppose the returning king. Edward quickly adjusted his plans. On 25th March, he crossed the River Trent and marched south toward Leicester. As he moved through the Midlands, more supporters joined him, including several thousand experienced soldiers, connected to William, Lord Hastings. These men were led by Sir William Norris, and added valuable strength to Edward's growing army. At roughly the same time, Warwick received troubling news from London. Two key Lancastrian supporters, the Duke of Somerset and Sir John Courtenay, heir to the title of Earl of Devon, had abandoned the capital. They had left King Henry VI under the protection of Warwick's brother, George Neville, Archbishop of York, and departed to meet Margaret of Anjou, who was expected to arrive from France with reinforcements. Their departure weakened Warwick's political position in London, although he soon received encouraging news that his brother, John Neville, known as Montague, had finally left Pontefract and was marching south with an army to reinforce him. During these tense days, another figure remained suspiciously inactive: George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's own brother. Even after hearing that Edward had returned to England, Clarence stayed at Burford with his forces and revealed little about his intentions. Rumours circulated widely about which side he would ultimately support. The uncertainty lasted until early April. On the second day of that month, Edward learned that Clarence had begun moving north with his retainers and was approaching Banbury. Edward, meanwhile, had reached Coventry, only to discover that Warwick had arrived there first and taken a strong defensive position inside the city walls. Warwick refused to come out and fight. Shortly afterward, Clarence sent word to Edward, proposing a meeting and reconciliation. On the morning of the 3rd of April, the Yorkist army left Coventry and marched toward Banbury, where the two brothers met on the road. Their reunion appeared genuine, and contemporary observers noted that their conversation was warm and friendly. Clarence's troops now joined Edward's army. Strengthened by this new support, Edward returned to Coventry and once again challenged Warwick to battle. Yet Warwick still refused to leave the protection of the city. He was likely waiting for Montague's approaching army, which would give him stronger numbers before confronting the Yorkists. Warwick had also previously received a letter from Clarence suggesting that he hold his position until Clarence could reinforce him. Now that Clarence had openly sided with Edward, Warwick had little interest in speaking with his son-in-law again. When Clarence attempted to approach the city as a mediator, Warwick refused even to meet him. Edward remained near Coventry until the 5th of April. With Warwick unwilling to fight and food supplies beginning to diminish, the Yorkist leaders decided to march toward London instead. At the same time, Margaret of Anjou was expected to land in England at any moment. The news that Edward was advancing on the capital caused panic among many Londoners. The city's mayor, John Stockton, found himself receiving conflicting orders from both Warwick and Edward and withdrew from public duties entirely. Lancastrian supporters in London attempted to rally the population. Archbishop George Neville and the elderly Lord Sudeley led King Henry VI through the streets in a public procession meant to inspire loyalty. The display failed to achieve its purpose. Henry appeared frail and passive, and the spectacle only reinforced the impression that he was incapable of leadership. Soon afterward, many citizens quietly decided they would not resist Edward's return. Edward advanced through Daventry, Dunstable, and St Albans before entering London on the 11th of April. His first destination was St Paul's Cathedral, where he gave thanks for his safe arrival. From there, he moved quickly to secure Henry VI. Archbishop Neville had already agreed to surrender the Lancastrian king and delivered Henry into Edward's custody soon after the Yorkist army reached the city. According to later accounts, the two men greeted each other calmly. Henry reportedly welcomed Edward and expressed confidence that his life would be spared. Henry was immediately taken to the Tower of London. Edward then travelled to Westminster Abbey, where he reunited with his wife Elizabeth Woodville and met his young son for the first time. The child had been born while Edward was in exile. By the following day, the capital was filled with Yorkist supporters who had come to join the king. Among them were experienced commanders including Sir John Howard, Sir Ralph Hastings, and Lord Cromwell. While Edward was organising his forces, he received urgent news. Warwick had assembled a large army composed of his own followers and Lancastrian allies, including the forces of Oxford and Exeter, and was advancing toward London. The army had already reached St. Albans. Edward responded immediately. On the next morning, he led an army of roughly 9,000 or 10,000 soldiers out of London along the Great North Road. Among his commanders were Richard, Duke of Gloucester, George, Duke of Clarence, Lord Hastings, Earl Rivers, and many other noble supporters. Their destination was the town of Barnet, where Warwick's army had taken position. Late in the evening of the 13th of April, Edward's army approached Barnet. Scouts reported that Warwick's army, possibly numbering between 10,000 and 15,000 men, occupied a ridge north of the town. Rather than wait until morning, Edward ordered his troops to push forward into Barnet, despite the fading light. Warwick's advance guards were driven from the town, and the Yorkists continued onto the open ground beyond before making camp for the night. This unexpected night movement produced two important consequences. First, the two armies ended up much closer together than either side realised. Second, the lines of battle were slightly misaligned. Each army's right flank extended beyond the left flank of its opponent. Warwick knew the Yorkists were somewhere nearby in the darkness. He ordered his artillery to fire into the night in hopes of disturbing the enemy camp. The guns continued firing for hours, but the shots overshot their targets and landed harmlessly behind the Yorkist lines. Edward, determined not to reveal his exact position, kept his own artillery silent. Before dawn on Easter Sunday, April 14th, Warwick prepared his army for battle. A thick fog covered the entire battlefield. Reports soon arrived confirming that the Lancastrian forces were ready. Oxford commanded the right wing, Montague held the centre, and the Duke of Exeter led the left. Warwick himself controlled a reserve of loyal retainers positioned behind the main line. Edward arranged his army in a similar formation. Lord Hastings commanded the left wing, while the 18-year-old Richard of Gloucester led the right. Edward took position in the centre together with his reserves. Clarence remained beside the king, his loyalty still regarded with some caution. Shortly after 4 in the morning, Warwick opened the battle with cannon fire and volleys of arrows directed into the fog. Edward responded by ordering a general advance. Trumpets sounded through the mist as the Yorkist army moved forward. Warwick immediately ordered his own troops to attack as well. As the two armies closed, it became clear that both right wings had extended beyond their opponents' left flanks. Oxford quickly seized the advantage, striking the Yorkist left under Lord Hastings from the side and partially from behind. At the same time, reports reached Warwick that Gloucester had gained a similar advantage against the Lancastrian left. Warwick committed part of his reserve to stabilise the threatened flank. Heavy fighting erupted along the entire line. On the Lancastrian left, the reinforcements prevented a complete collapse, and brutal, close combat developed between the men of Exeter and Gloucester. The Yorkist left wing was less fortunate. Hastings' troops were caught by surprise by Oxford's attack and soon began to break apart. Many fled toward Barnet, spreading panic and rumours of total defeat. Oxford's soldiers pursued them into the town, where some began looting. The Earl of Oxford struggled to regain control of his men, but was unable to halt their momentum. Meanwhile, fierce combat continued in the centre. Edward's soldiers fought stubbornly, but were slowly being pushed back. Warwick's arrival with additional reserves strengthened Lancastrian morale. For a moment it seemed the battle might turn in their favour. After several hours, Warwick believed victory was within reach. News arrived that Oxford had regrouped his cavalry and was returning to the battlefield. Yet events were about to take an unexpected turn. Oxford's men rode back toward the fighting through the fog. The battlefield had shifted during the struggle, and visibility remained extremely poor. Instead of striking Edward's rear, Oxford's cavalry accidentally approached the Lancastrian centre, commanded by Montague. Montague's soldiers, seeing horsemen advancing toward them, mistook Oxford's banner for that of the Yorkists and opened fire with arrows. The result was immediate confusion. Oxford's men shouted accusations of betrayal and fled the field. Their cries of treason spread quickly across the Lancastrian ranks. Warwick and Montague attempted to restore order, but the damage had already begun. Edward sensed the disorder and seized the opportunity. Rallying his troops, he launched a renewed attack against the Lancastrian centre. Surrounded by his personal retainers, he drove directly toward Montague's position. The Lancastrian line began to falter. At the rear of the field, Warwick learned that Exeter's forces had collapsed and that the left flank was breaking apart. Moments later, he heard that Montague had fallen in the fighting. The Lancastrian army rapidly disintegrated as soldiers fled in all directions. Realizing the battle was lost, Warwick attempted to reach his horse and escape. The fighting had carried the army far from its original position, and the distance to the horses was considerable. Burdened by heavy armour, Warwick was overtaken by Yorkist soldiers before he could mount and was killed. With his death, the battle effectively ended. Yorkist troops spread across the field pursuing the defeated enemy. The victory secured Edward's position once again as king. Warwick's body and that of his brother Montague were later taken to London. They were displayed publicly so that no doubt would remain about their deaths. Despite their rebellion, Edward allowed them to be buried in their family tomb, rather than subjecting them to the usual punishment reserved for traitors. The conflict had claimed many lives. Lancastrian casualties were heavy as fleeing soldiers were cut down during the pursuit. Yorkist losses were also significant among the nobles who had fought for Edward's cause. Edward returned to London in triumph on the 16th of April. Yet the victory at Barnet did not end the war. At the very moment the battle was concluding, ships carrying Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward, were approaching the English coast. Another confrontation was already on the horizon. Margaret had been preparing her expedition in France while Edward and Warwick were manoeuvring in England. Unfavourable winds delayed her fleet for more than 2 weeks, preventing it from leaving harbour. Finally, on the 13th of April, the weather improved and the ships sailed from Honfleur. The crossing was swift, and by the evening of 14th April, the fleet reached the English port of Weymouth. Margaret travelled to Cerne Abbey soon after landing. There she was joined by the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Devon, who had already gathered supporters in the west of England. When news arrived that Warwick had been defeated and killed at Barnet, and that Henry VI had been taken prisoner, Margaret was reportedly overwhelmed with grief. Some of her allies immediately abandoned the campaign. Yet Somerset urged her to continue the struggle. He argued that Warwick's fall might actually strengthen the Lancastrian cause by removing a controversial figure whose ambitions had divided supporters. Encouraged by Somerset's determination, Margaret agreed to proceed. The Lancastrian army moved toward Exeter and began gathering reinforcements from across Devon and Cornwall. Many local leaders joined the cause, believing the arrival of the Queen and her son represented a final opportunity to restore the Lancastrian dynasty. In London, Edward learned of Margaret's landing only 2 days after his triumph at Barnet. Once again, he acted quickly. Orders were issued across the country to summon fresh troops. Edward began preparing a westward march to intercept the Lancastrian army before it could gather additional strength. Margaret's forces moved from Exeter toward Taunton, drawing increasing support along the way. Meanwhile, Edward advanced slowly from London while waiting for reinforcements and transporting artillery captured from Warwick. The Lancastrians attempted to confuse their enemy by sending small detachments in several directions. Some units marched eastward toward towns in southern England, while the main body moved north toward the River Severn. Edward studied the reports carefully and concluded that the eastern movements were only a diversion. The true objective was likely to cross the Severn and join forces with Jasper Tudor in Wales. Edward marched west in pursuit. After several days of rapid movement, he learned that Margaret's army had reached Bristol and gathered new supplies, weapons, and recruits. Soon afterward, news arrived that the Lancastrians had left Bristol and were heading north. Both armies raced toward the river crossings. The Lancastrians hoped to reach Gloucester first and cross safely into Wales. Yet Edward had already anticipated this possibility and secretly instructed the governor of Gloucester to deny them entry to the town. When Margaret's army arrived at Gloucester on the 3rd of May, they found the gates closed against them. With Edward's army approaching rapidly, they had no choice but to continue north toward the next crossing at Tewkesbury. Exhausted from forced marches, the Lancastrian soldiers reached Tewkesbury late that evening and made camp south of the town. The river crossing would have to wait until morning. The defeat of the Lancastrian army at Tewkesbury did not end every struggle on the battlefield. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had managed to survive the chaos of the retreat. Unlike many of his soldiers who were cut down while fleeing, Somerset was still mounted and able to ride back toward the remaining Lancastrian position. What followed was a dramatic and revealing moment. Furious that Lord Wenlock had failed to support his assault during the battle, Somerset reportedly confronted him directly in the midst of the confusion and struck him down with an axe. Wenlock was killed instantly. This violent outburst removed one of the few remaining senior commanders, still attempting to organise the Lancastrian centre. With both Somerset and Wenlock caught in their own confrontation and the army already collapsing, the responsibility for command fell to the young Prince Edward of Lancaster, who was only 17 years old. Earlier that same morning, the prince and his mother, Queen Margaret, had ridden along the Lancastrian lines to encourage their soldiers. The moment carried a strong sense of desperation. Margaret, who had once been a determined and formidable political leader during the earlier years of the conflict, now appeared exhausted by a decade of struggle and exile. After addressing the troops, she withdrew from the immediate battlefield area for safety. The prince remained with the army. His military experience was extremely limited, and once the battle began to unravel around him, there was little he could do to restore order. When the Lancastrian lines collapsed and the soldiers began to flee, Prince Edward was caught in the disaster that followed. Accounts of his death vary widely. Some reports claim that he was captured alive and executed shortly afterward by Yorkist commanders, while others describe him being killed during the fighting itself. Another story suggests that he called out to his brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, hoping for protection before he was struck down. The confusion of battle makes it impossible to determine exactly what happened. It is entirely possible that the prince simply became one more casualty among the many soldiers who fell that day. His ornate armour would have made him an obvious target for soldiers hoping to capture or kill a wealthy nobleman. Today, a memorial plaque inside Tewkesbury Abbey is traditionally believed to mark the place where his body was laid to rest. With the battle concluded, the consequences for both sides quickly became clear. The Yorkists had achieved a decisive victory while suffering relatively limited losses. None of Edward's leading commanders had been killed. The Lancastrian leadership, however, had suffered devastating losses. In addition to the death of Prince Edward, Somerset's brother Sir John Beaufort was killed, along with Sir John Courtenay, Earl of Devon and Lord Wenlock. The destruction of so many senior figures effectively ended the Lancastrian military leadership in England. Many of the surviving Lancastrian nobles attempted to escape the violence by seeking refuge in Tewkesbury Abbey. Among those who entered the abbey was the Duke of Somerset himself. Shortly after the fighting ended, King Edward arrived and entered the church to give thanks for his victory. In a moment that appeared generous, he initially granted pardon to those who had taken shelter there. Yet the abbey did not legally qualify as a protected sanctuary, and Edward soon withdrew his promise. The Lancastrian nobles who had gathered inside were arrested and placed in custody. 2 days later, they were brought before a tribunal. The proceedings were conducted under the authority of the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Norfolk. The charges were treason and the outcome was predictable. Somerset, Sir John Langstrother, Sir Gervase Clifton, and several other Lancastrian knights were condemned. They were taken into the marketplace at Tewkesbury and executed by beheading. A few individuals were spared, including Sir John Fortescue, Sir Thomas Ormond, and Sir Henry Roose. Queen Margaret herself managed to escape the immediate slaughter, but was captured soon afterward while hiding in a nearby religious house. She was taken to London and imprisoned in the Tower. Later, she was transferred to Wallingford Castle under the supervision of the widowed Duchess of Suffolk. Several years afterward, the French king arranged her release by paying a ransom. Margaret returned to France, where she spent the remainder of her life in relative obscurity. She died in 1482 near the town of Saumur in Anjou and was buried in the cathedral at Angers alongside members of her family. Although Edward had achieved a decisive military victory, his position was still not entirely secure. News soon reached him that disturbances had broken out in Kent. For a moment, it appeared that the king would have to march north to deal with other threats, but the situation shifted again as reports arrived of additional unrest. Edward left Tewkesbury on the 7th of May and travelled to Coventry, where he remained several days gathering forces and assessing the situation. The uprising in Kent had been organised by Thomas Neville, widely known as the Bastard of Fauconberg. Neville had been at sea commanding ships in the English Channel when Edward first returned to England earlier that year. Because of this, he had been unable to support his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, at the Battle of Barnet. Nevertheless, he remained loyal to the Neville cause and quickly gathered supporters among the population of Kent, Essex, and Surrey. Many people in those regions were already hostile toward the Yorkist government. Fauconberg's rebellion gained strength when he was joined by Nicholas Faunt, the Mayor of Canterbury, and by soldiers from the garrison of Calais. Fauconberg transported these troops across the Channel and assembled a sizable force. By mid-May, the rebels advanced toward London and attempted to enter the city. On 12th May, Fauconberg launched the first assault. His fleet sailed up the River Thames while his army approached the city gates. The citizens of London, fearful for their homes and property, organised a determined defence under the leadership of the mayor and other city officials. The attack failed and the rebels were forced to withdraw. 2 days later, they tried again. This time they attempted to cross London Bridge and force their way into the city, with the support of cannon fire from ships positioned on the river. Once again the defenders resisted successfully. Reinforcements led by Earl Rivers and other Yorkist supporters joined the defence. A counterattack from the Tower of London pushed the rebels back across the surrounding fields toward Poplar. After this failure, Fauconberg regrouped his followers at Blore Heath. Soon afterward he learned that Edward himself was approaching London with an army. Faced with the king's arrival and the collapse of his attack, Fauconberg abandoned the attempt and retreated toward the coast. He travelled through Rochester and eventually reached Sandwich. The soldiers from the Calais garrison soon deserted him and returned home. Edward entered London triumphantly on 21st May. As he approached the city, he was greeted by its leaders, whom he rewarded with knighthoods for their defence of the capital. With the king now present, the rebellion quickly dissolved. Nicholas Faunt was later captured and executed for treason. Fauconberg was initially pardoned because his ships were considered valuable, but he was eventually arrested and executed later that year. Around the same time, another dramatic event occurred. King Henry VI died in the Tower of London during the night shortly before Edward's arrival in the city. Official accounts claimed that Henry died from grief after hearing of the defeat at Tewkesbury and the death of his son. Few believed this explanation. Many suspected that Henry had been murdered in order to eliminate him as a possible focus for future Lancastrian resistance. Stories quickly circulated about the circumstances of his death. When Henry's body was displayed before burial, observers noted traces of blood on his face and hair. Some later suggested that he had been killed with a blow to the head. Suspicion also fell on Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who held authority over the tower at the time and was present in London that night. Whatever the truth may have been, Henry's death removed the last reigning Lancastrian king and ended any realistic chance of restoring his dynasty through him. The victory at Tewkesbury marked a turning point in the Wars of the Roses. For the Lancastrians, the defeat was as devastating as the earlier disaster at Towton had been a decade before. Edward had now fought in 5 major battles and emerged victorious in every one. His reputation as a successful military leader strengthened his authority across England. When Edward returned to London later in May 1471, he could claim, with some justification, to rule the entire kingdom. Even in Wales, resistance collapsed. Jasper Tudor, one of the last remaining Lancastrian leaders, abandoned any immediate attempt to continue the struggle and fled to France together with his young nephew Henry of Richmond. Apart from a minor and unsuccessful invasion attempt 2 years later, England remained largely peaceful for the rest of Edward's reign. Edward IV died in 1483 after a sudden illness. His death reopened the political tensions that had been temporarily suppressed by his victories. Edward left behind a young heir, the 12-year-old Edward V. The late king had appointed his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of the kingdom until the boy reached adulthood. However, another powerful faction at court had its own ambitions. The family of the Queen, the Woodvilles, feared that Richard and his northern allies would dominate the government if he became protector. They moved quickly to secure power before Richard could act. The Queen's son from a previous marriage seized the royal treasury, while other relatives attempted to control key military resources. At the time of his father's death, the young king Edward V was living at Ludlow under the care of his maternal relatives. News of the king's death reached Ludlow first, while Richard received the information several days later in the north. This delay deepened Richard's suspicion that the Woodvilles intended to control the government. Plans were soon made to bring the young king to London for his coronation. On the journey south, he travelled with a large escort led by his uncle Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters. Meanwhile, Richard and his ally, the Duke of Buckingham, moved south with their own forces. The two parties finally encountered each other near Northampton. During the night, Richard ordered the arrest of Earl Rivers and several other members of the King's escort. They were later sent north under guard. The next morning, Richard intercepted the King's party at Stony Stratford and took custody of the young monarch, claiming that he had rescued him from the influence of the Woodville faction. News of these events quickly reached Queen Elizabeth in London. Fearing for her family's safety, she fled to Westminster Abbey with her younger son and daughters and claimed sanctuary. Meanwhile, Richard escorted Edward V to the capital. He was formally recognised as protector of the realm until the coronation could take place. The young king was lodged in the Tower of London, which traditionally served as the royal residence before coronation ceremonies. Soon afterward, Richard persuaded the Queen to allow the king's younger brother to join him in the Tower. From that point forward, the two princes were rarely seen in public again. Rumours soon spread that Richard intended to claim the throne himself. In June 1483, events moved rapidly. A dramatic council meeting ended with the arrest and execution of Lord Hastings, one of the most powerful supporters of the previous king. Soon afterward, Richard cancelled the coronation of Edward V. Supporters of Richard then argued publicly that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid and that his children were therefore illegitimate. On these grounds, Richard was invited by an assembly of nobles and city leaders to accept the crown. After a brief display of hesitation, he agreed. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. His reign had begun, but it would be marked by suspicion and political tension. Rumours about the fate of the princes in the Tower continued to circulate, damaging his reputation throughout the kingdom. During the summer of 1485, the struggle for the English crown was moving toward its final and decisive moment. On the 17th of August, Henry Tudor entered the town of Stafford, where he finally managed to meet Sir William Stanley. Stanley had left his army near Stone and arrived with only a small group of attendants in order to speak privately with Henry. No record survives of their conversation, but whatever was said must have given Henry enough encouragement to continue his march deeper into England. After the meeting, Stanley returned to his own forces, while Henry pressed onward with renewed determination. The following day, August 18th, Henry reached the city of Lichfield. The citizens greeted him warmly, a sign that his support among the population was growing as he moved across the country. Only a day earlier, Sir Thomas Stanley had left the town after receiving a letter from his son, Lord Strange, who was being held by King Richard as a hostage to guarantee the Stanleys' loyalty. Thomas Stanley's movements were deliberately unclear. His army began marching east toward Leicester, a move that may have been intended to convince Richard that he was obeying royal orders. At the same time, his uncertain actions left Henry unsure whether the powerful Stanley family would truly support him when the decisive moment arrived. Their intentions remained hidden until the very end. Meanwhile, King Richard was waiting in Nottingham, while he summoned his commanders to assemble at Leicester. Reports soon reached him that loyalty among his nobles was weakening. The Stanley brothers had ignored his call to arms, and other figures also hesitated. Sir John Paston, for example, failed to appear even after receiving a personal message urging him to join the king. In another incident, two knights suspected of wavering loyalty, Sir Thomas Bourchier and Sir Walter Hungerford, were ordered to travel under the supervision of the trusted royal officer Sir Robert Brackenbury. Yet during their journey north, the two men escaped in the night and rode away to join Henry Tudor. Despite these troubling signs, Richard was not without support. The mayor and citizens of York sent word offering to raise men for their king and asking where they should gather. Their message encouraged Richard, yet it also raised new concerns. They claimed that they had never received instructions to assemble at Leicester. If this was true, then the powerful Earl of Northumberland had failed to pass along the royal command. Northumberland did eventually arrive at Leicester with troops, but the confusion surrounding his actions only deepened Richard's doubts about where his loyalty truly lay. On the morning of the 17th of August, Richard finally left Nottingham and marched toward Leicester to meet his assembled forces. Even though several nobles had failed to answer his summons, he still believed he had enough men to defeat Henry Tudor in open battle. By August 20th, Henry advanced toward Tamworth. At first he intended to stop there for the night, but he chose instead to continue marching. As darkness fell, he somehow became separated from the main body of his army, and spent an anxious night with only a few companions before he was able to locate his troops again the following morning. Soon afterward he arrived at the town of Atherstone. There he met both of the Stanley brothers. Their conversation was brief and cautious. The Stanleys were still unwilling to declare openly for Henry, largely because Lord Strange remained a prisoner in Richard's camp. After the meeting, they returned to their own forces and continued to wait. One man did join Henry without hesitation that day: Sir John Savage. Richard had already branded him a traitor, and with nothing left to lose, he brought a large group of followers to Henry's side. When Richard learned that Henry had reached Lichfield, he realised that delay was dangerous. He marched west along the old road through Peckleton and Kirkby Mallory before setting up camp on the evening of the 21st of August near Sutton Cheney, only a short distance from the village of Market Bosworth. At almost the same time, Henry left Atherstone and moved in the direction where his scouts believed Richard's army was approaching. The separate armies of the Stanley brothers marched nearby on parallel routes, still avoiding a final commitment. Both royal forces arrived in the same area that evening. Richard's army camped near Sutton Cheney, while Henry's men rested less than 4 miles away, at a place called Whitemoors. The two armies were now close enough that a confrontation was inevitable. The following day would decide who would wear the crown of England. At dawn the next morning, both armies broke camp and prepared for battle. Richard's scouts had gathered more accurate information about the terrain, and the king understood the situation more clearly than his opponent. Between the two forces stood a rise in the land known today as Ambion Hill. Controlling this higher ground would provide a clear tactical advantage, and both sides quickly realised that reaching the hill first could determine the outcome of the battle. Richard ordered his troops to advance quickly in the marching formations they had maintained since leaving Leicester. Instead of spreading out immediately into a traditional battle line, the army moved forward in column, allowing it to travel faster. The vanguard was commanded by the Duke of Norfolk. The king himself led the central division, and the Earl of Northumberland controlled the rear. Henry Tudor was slower to move his men, but under the guidance of the experienced Earl of Oxford, he also began marching toward the hill. The race for the high ground had begun. Richard's army reached Ambion Hill first. Norfolk positioned his troops along the crest, while Richard halted with the centre of the army slightly behind them. Northumberland remained further to the rear. The ridge itself was not especially wide, and only part of Richard's army could form a line along its length. Henry's army soon approached the hill, but his scouts had overlooked a serious obstacle. A marsh lay directly between his forces and the slope. When his leading troops encountered the wet ground, they were forced to turn sharply to the left and move several hundred yards north before they could form a proper battle line. During this manoeuvre, their flank was exposed to the archers positioned in Norfolk's vanguard. Yet no attack came. Whether Norfolk hesitated out of caution or simple misjudgment, his inaction allowed Henry's troops to take their positions without interference. Henry's army finally formed a line facing the hill. His vanguard was commanded by the Earl of Oxford together with the French commander, Philibert de Chandé. Henry himself stood with the central division beside his uncle Jasper Tudor. Additional forces on the flanks were led by Sir Gilbert Talbot and Sir John Savage. In total, Henry's army numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 soldiers, including many experienced knights who had joined him during his journey through Wales and England. Richard's army was larger, perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 men. Among his commanders were the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Surrey, the Earl of Northumberland, Sir Robert Brackenbury, Viscount Lovell, Sir Richard Ratcliffe, Lord Zouch, Lord Ferrers, William Catesby, and several other loyal nobles. The king possessed the advantage in numbers and occupied the higher ground. On paper, the odds appeared to favour him. Yet, another factor now entered the battlefield. The armies of the Stanley brothers finally arrived and positioned themselves to the north and south of the opposing forces. Sir William Stanley commanded about 3,000 men to the north, while his brother Thomas held perhaps 5,000 to the south. Both groups remained motionless, observing the two armies that stood ready to fight. Richard could not ignore their presence. If the Stanleys remained neutral, his superior position and larger army almost guaranteed victory. But if they joined Henry Tudor, the balance of power would suddenly shift. Henry understood this equally well. Hoping to secure their support, he sent a message asking Sir William Stanley to bring his men into the battle. Stanley's reply was brief and cautious. Henry should prepare his own forces, he said, and the Stanleys would decide their moment. With no other option, Henry prepared to fight. The battle opened with a brief exchange of cannon fire and arrows. After this initial volley, both sides paused for a moment before advancing toward each other. Soon the two armies collided halfway down the slope of Ambion Hill. The clash turned quickly into a fierce struggle of close combat as the forward divisions fought with swords, spears, and axes. For nearly an hour the battle raged without a clear winner. Reinforcements from the central divisions moved forward to support the men already engaged. It was during this brutal struggle that the Stanley armies finally began to move. What followed has been debated ever since. One widely accepted account describes how Henry Tudor, realizing the danger of fighting uphill against a larger force, rode towards Sir William Stanley with a small group of companions in order to urge him to join the battle immediately. From his elevated position, Richard noticed Henry's banner moving across the field. Seeing an opportunity to end the war with a single strike, he gathered a group of mounted retainers and charged downhill toward Henry's position. The king's charge came dangerously close to success. In the clash that followed, Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, was killed, a sign that Richard's riders had nearly reached Henry himself. But at that moment, the soldiers of Sir William Stanley rushed forward and surrounded Richard's small cavalry force. Outnumbered and fighting on foot after losing his horse, the king was struck down in the fighting. Another interpretation suggests that Richard already understood the Stanleys would betray him. Seeing their forces advance and noticing that Northumberland remained inactive in the rear, Richard realized that defeat was approaching. In a final act of desperation, he launched a charge toward the position of Thomas Stanley himself, hoping to kill the man whose shifting loyalty had played such a decisive role. Whether he attempted to ride around the marsh or cross it directly remains uncertain. What is known is that Richard was unhorsed and overwhelmed by Stanley's soldiers. However the final moments unfolded, the result was the same. King Richard III died on the battlefield. News of his death spread rapidly through the Yorkist army, and resistance quickly collapsed as soldiers fled the field. The events of that morning marked not only the fall of a king, but also the end of the House of York. In its place, the Tudor dynasty rose to power and would rule England for more than a century. Many nobles died in the battle alongside Richard. The Duke of Norfolk, Sir Robert Brackenbury, Lord Ferrers, Sir Richard Ratcliffe and Sir Gervase Clifton all fell during the fighting. On Henry's side, the most notable casualty was Sir William Brandon. Around 3,000 soldiers were killed in total, most of them Yorkists. Several prominent supporters of Richard managed to escape, though some were later captured or forced into exile. After the battle, Henry is said to have paused on a nearby hill southeast of the battlefield. There, Thomas Stanley retrieved Richard's fallen crown, reportedly discovered beneath a hawthorn bush, and placed it upon Henry's head, proclaiming him King of England. The place where this ceremony occurred later became known as Crown Hill. Later that same day, Henry entered the town of Leicester. Richard's body was carried there across a horse and displayed publicly for several days so that no one could doubt that the king was truly dead. His remains were eventually buried in the Church of Greyfriars. No one knows exactly when the idea first appeared to present Lambert Simnel as the imprisoned Earl of Warwick. The identity of the people who originally shaped the conspiracy also remains uncertain. What is clear is that the scheme quickly gained unexpected momentum once it reached Ireland. When the priest Richard Simons introduced the boy to Gerald Fitzgerald, the powerful Earl of Kildare, he presented him as Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence. Clarence himself had been born in Ireland, and that connection seems to have helped the story gain credibility. To Simon's surprise, the young impostor was accepted almost immediately. The Irish nobility welcomed him as a Yorkist prince and a rightful claimant to the English throne. Several motives likely influenced this enthusiastic response. Many Irish lords believed that supporting the Yorkist cause could strengthen their own political position. Some hoped that backing a rival king might bring greater independence or influence for Ireland within the English realm. By accepting the story that Simnel was truly the Earl of Warwick, they provided the Yorkist movement with something it desperately needed: a secure base of operations. Ireland now became the centre from which the conspiracy could grow. At first, it is unclear how deeply involved the exiled Yorkist leaders were in the early stages of the plan. Yet once word reached them that a convincing figurehead existed, they moved quickly. Among those who became central to the scheme were Francis Lovell and John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. Lincoln had once shown loyalty to Henry VII, but his bloodline made him a natural focus for Yorkist supporters. His mother was the sister of both Edward IV and Richard III, and many believed that Richard III had considered him a potential heir. Lincoln soon abandoned Henry's service and joined the Yorkist exiles in Burgundy. There, they found an important ally in Margaret of Burgundy, sister to the Yorkist kings Edward IV and Richard III. Margaret was determined to see the Yorkist cause restored, and was willing to provide both money and political support. Her funding allowed the conspirators to hire experienced soldiers and prepare ships to transport them across the sea. A force of around 2,000 German mercenaries was recruited under the command of the seasoned captain Martin Schwartz. These troops had previously fought in continental wars and had developed a reputation for discipline and ruthless effectiveness in battle. When preparations were complete, Lovell, Lincoln, and their supporters sailed from Burgundy to Ireland. Their small fleet carried not only the German soldiers, but also Yorkist exiles who had fled England after earlier failed revolts. Among them were men who had once served in the garrison at Calais and who still held strong loyalty to the Yorkist dynasty. While these events were unfolding abroad, King Henry VII was already beginning to hear rumours of the growing movement. By early 1487, reports reached him that a boy claiming to be the Earl of Warwick was attracting attention. At first the threat may have seemed minor, but as the months passed, the movement gathered supporters and Henry began to take the danger seriously. By April, he realised that the conspiracy could develop into a full military invasion. Most of the known Yorkist leaders were in Burgundy at that time, so Henry assumed that any invasion would likely strike the southern or eastern coast of England. To respond quickly if such an attack occurred, he moved his court to Norwich during the Easter season. From there, he could monitor the coastline and organise defences. In an attempt to expose the deception, Henry ordered the real Earl of Warwick, who was still imprisoned in the Tower of London, to be brought out and shown publicly in the streets of London. The intention was simple. If people saw Warwick alive in England, the claims surrounding Simnel would collapse. Instead, the move produced the opposite effect. Supporters of the conspiracy quickly argued that the man displayed in London was the impostor, while the real Warwick, they insisted, was the youth in Ireland preparing to reclaim his throne. Soon afterward, Henry learned that Lovell and Lincoln had left Burgundy and sailed to Ireland. This information changed his expectations about where the invasion would begin. If the conspirators were gathering forces in Ireland, they were unlikely to land in the south. Henry therefore moved his base of operations from Lincoln to Coventry, positioning himself to respond to an attack from the northwest. Events in Ireland were now moving quickly. Shortly after the arrival of Lovell and Lincoln, the Yorkist leaders organised a dramatic ceremony to strengthen their claim. On 24th May, 1487, Lambert Simnel was crowned as King Edward VI inside Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. The crown used in the ceremony was said to have been a gold circlet taken from a statue within the cathedral itself. Although the boy had no real royal blood, the symbolism of the coronation was powerful. It allowed the conspirators to present their cause as the restoration of the rightful Yorkist monarchy. The alliance formed around Simnel soon attracted more supporters. A number of English exiles arrived in Ireland to join the enterprise, including experienced soldiers and noblemen dissatisfied with Henry's rule. Irish troops under the leadership of Thomas Geraldine also pledged their support. With these forces, along with the hired German mercenaries, the Yorkist leaders began planning a military invasion of England. Henry VII was well aware that conflict was approaching. He ordered warning beacons to be prepared along the coastline so that news of any landing could spread quickly. At the same time, he summoned his nobles to gather at Kenilworth Castle near Coventry, where he coordinated plans for the defence of the kingdom. The invasion finally began at the start of June 1487. On the fourth day of that month, the rebel army sailed from Dublin and landed on the coast of Lancashire. Their chosen landing site was near Peel Island in the Furness region. The location was carefully selected because Sir Thomas Broughton, a Yorkist supporter who had taken part in earlier revolts, held influence in that area. Once ashore, the invaders immediately declared their loyalty to King Edward VI, the name they used for Simnel. Without delay, they marched inland and made camp that evening near Swarthmore, close to the town of Ulverston. There they were joined by Broughton and his followers, strengthening their ranks. The following day, the army moved east toward Yorkshire. As it advanced, it gathered additional support. At Carnforth, new troops arrived from the Harrington and Middleton families, who had never accepted Henry's rule. With each new reinforcement, the rebel army grew larger and more confident. By this stage, the force numbered perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 men. The leaders hoped that as they marched deeper into northern England, even more supporters would join them. Crossing into Yorkshire near Sedbergh, they soon attracted further recruits, including several northern gentlemen who still favoured the Yorkist cause. By the time the army reached Masham, their numbers may have risen to 8,000 or 9,000 men. Local noble families showed sympathy toward the rebellion, although many were unprepared for the speed with which the army had arrived. Announced his intention to enter the city and gather supplies. York had once been a strong centre of Yorkist support, and the rebels hoped the city would welcome them. Yet the city's leaders hesitated. Under Henry VII, the city had not suffered significant losses, and the king had granted it several privileges. At the same time, York had a complicated political history and could not easily commit itself to another rebellion. When a message arrived from the powerful Earl of Northumberland promising to defend the city against the rebels, the decision was made. York would remain loyal to Henry. The response delivered to Lincoln was direct and uncompromising. The city authorities declared that the man calling himself Edward VI would not be allowed to enter York. If the rebels attempted to force their way inside, the citizens vowed to resist with everything they possessed. This refusal was a serious setback for the rebel leaders. Yet Lincoln understood that hesitation could destroy the fragile unity of his army. Instead of wasting time outside the city, he ordered the army to continue marching south. Meanwhile, Henry VII had already begun moving his own forces northward to intercept the invasion. With both armies advancing rapidly toward the same region, a confrontation was becoming inevitable. Armed conflict would soon decide the fate of the rebellion and determine whether the Tudor dynasty could survive its first great challenge. The charge led by Henry Hotspur Percy began with dramatic success. From the higher ground, his men rushed downhill toward the royal lines, crashing into the king's front ranks with enormous force. The momentum of the assault shattered the first line of Henry IV's army and briefly created the impression that the rebels might win the day. Yet the same speed and aggression that made the attack so powerful also placed Hotspur's forces in a dangerous position. On the left side of the king's army stood the troops commanded by the Prince of Wales. Unlike many of the soldiers elsewhere in the royal host, these men had recently campaigned in the difficult terrain of Wales and were hardened by real experience in battle. When Hotspur's charge swept down the hill and struck the royal army, these seasoned soldiers held their ground. As the fighting turned into a violent hand-to-hand struggle, the prince's troops gradually began to push back the opposing line in front of them. The rebel soldiers facing them were less experienced and began to lose their cohesion. Slowly, the royal left flank forced Hotspur's right flank back toward the hillside from which it had descended. Once the rebel formation started to give way, the advantage quickly shifted. The prince seized the opportunity and manoeuvred his forces around the exposed side of the rebel army. His men began striking the rebels from the flank and then from the rear, threatening to encircle them entirely. The situation for Hotspur's army suddenly became desperate. What had begun as a powerful attack was now turning into a deadly trap. Surrounded by enemies and unable to regain the initiative, the rebels fought with fierce determination. The struggle became one of the most brutal moments of the battle. The king's soldiers sensed that victory might be close, while the rebels understood that defeat would likely mean death or execution. Steel clashed at close quarters as both sides fought with the intensity that comes when everything is at stake. It was during this chaotic phase of the battle that the fate of the rebellion was sealed. In the midst of the fighting, Hotspur himself was struck down. According to later reports, an arrow hit him in the head, killing him instantly. The death of their leader spread through the rebel ranks with devastating speed. Hotspur had been the driving force behind the uprising and the most inspiring figure on the battlefield. Once word of his fall circulated among the soldiers, their resistance began to crumble. Units lost their coordination and the determination that had fueled their attack dissolved into confusion. Soon, the rebel army began to break apart. Groups of men fled the field while others threw down their weapons and attempted to escape. What had been a fierce contest quickly turned into a complete collapse. The king's army emerged victorious, and the Battle of Shrewsbury ended with a decisive triumph for Henry IV. The battle itself lasted more than 3 hours, and when the fighting stopped, the field was covered with the dead and wounded. Around 5,000 of Hotspur's supporters had been killed. Among the surviving rebel leaders, several important figures were captured. Sir Thomas Percy, the Earl of Worcester, along with Sir Richard Vernon and Sir Richard Venables, were taken alive. Their fate was sealed almost immediately. 2 days after the battle, they were executed at Shrewsbury's High Cross for treason against the king. The punishment was meant not only to eliminate the rebel leadership, but also to send a clear warning to anyone considering further revolt. Worcester's severed head was later displayed on London Bridge as a grim reminder of the consequences of rebellion. Another prominent figure captured during the battle was the Scottish nobleman, known as the Earl Douglas. Unlike many of the other prisoners, he was not executed. After spending a considerable time in captivity, he was eventually allowed to return to Scotland. Most of the Scottish warriors who had followed him into England, however, did not survive the day. The losses among the Scottish contingent were severe. The king's army had also suffered heavy casualties. About 1,600 royal soldiers were killed in the battle, including several notable nobles who had fought in support of Henry IV. Among those who died were Sir Edward Stafford, the Earl of Stafford, along with Sir Hugh Shirley, Sir John Clifton, Sir John Cockayne, Sir Nicholas Gowsell and Sir John Calvert. Their deaths illustrated how fiercely contested the struggle had been. Stories from the battle describe a dramatic moment earlier in the fighting. After the king's front line had been shattered by the downhill charge, Hotspur, Douglas, and a small group of their followers reportedly attempted to reach the king himself. Their goal was simple. If Henry IV could be killed, the battle might end instantly in rebel victory. During this attempt, the royal standard was knocked to the ground, creating confusion among the king's troops. Some accounts suggest that Henry's commanders urged him to withdraw from the front line to avoid exactly this kind of attack. Another defensive measure appears to have been used during the battle. Several knights in the royal army reportedly wore armour and clothing that resembled the king's own appearance. This was intended to confuse the rebels and make it harder for them to identify Henry's exact position. The tactic proved deadly for those who carried out the deception. At least 4 of these knights were killed during the fighting by Hotspur's assault group, including Sir Walter Blount. One of the most remarkable episodes of the battle involved the Prince of Wales. During the early stages of the fighting, he received a wound to the face. Those around him urged him to withdraw from the battlefield and seek treatment. Instead, he refused to leave. Despite the injury, he remained with his soldiers and continued to command them until the battle was won. His determination and leadership greatly strengthened his reputation. Years later, he would become famous as Henry V, the king who led England to victory in France and won lasting glory at the Battle of Agincourt. After the rebel army collapsed and began to flee, Henry IV made an unusual decision. Rather than encouraging his troops to pursue and destroy the retreating enemy, he ordered them to hold back. This restraint was not an act of mercy. The king wanted survivors to carry news of the defeat back to the north. By allowing the rebels to escape, he ensured that word of Hotspur's death and the destruction of the uprising would spread quickly through the regions where support for rebellion had been strongest. To commemorate the victory, Henry later ordered that a church be built on the site of the battle. The building became known as Battlefield Church. The battle had been fought on the eve of the feast day of St. Mary Magdalene, and the church was dedicated to her when it was completed. Tradition holds that the church stands either at the place where the king's standard fell during the fighting or near the spot where Hotspur himself was killed. Although Henry IV had won an important victory at Shrewsbury, rebellion continued to trouble his reign. Political unrest and opposition followed him throughout his rule. In 1413, the king died after suffering from a mysterious illness that had afflicted him for some time. Later, generations believed the disease might have been leprosy. Among the people of England, many believed that his illness was divine punishment for the execution of Sir Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, who had openly challenged the king's authority. Henry himself had long believed a prophecy claiming that he would die in Jerusalem. When the end finally came, the prophecy appeared to be fulfilled in an unexpected way. The king died in a chamber known as the Jerusalem Chapel within Westminster Abbey. After his death, his son, the Prince of Wales, succeeded him as Henry V. The new king inherited a kingdom secured by his father's victory at Shrewsbury, and the House of Lancaster continued to rule England for several decades before the outbreak of the long conflict, later known as the Wars of the Roses. Confusion also surrounds the identities of two figures known in northern England as Robin of Redesdale and Robin of Holderness. Some accounts have treated them as if they were the same person, but surviving evidence strongly suggests that they were separate individuals with different backgrounds and motives. The man known as Robin of Redesdale was most likely Sir William Conyers, a member of a powerful northern family connected by marriage to the influential Earl of Warwick. This connection explains why the name Robin of Redesdale became associated with uprisings that supported Warwick's political ambitions. However, an earlier figure bearing the same nickname appears in stories connected with Queen Margaret of Anjou during the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses. According to one story, after a defeat suffered by the Lancastrians near Hexham, Queen Margaret attempted to flee toward the coast in order to escape to France. A mysterious outlaw known as Robin of Redesdale supposedly guided her through the borderlands and helped her reach safety. Chronological details surrounding this tale do not fully align with known events, suggesting that the story may be more legend than fact. Another account describes an incident in which the Queen and her young son became separated from their companions while travelling through woodland near Hexham. Their horse stumbled while crossing a stream, leaving them vulnerable. A group of local outlaws discovered them and robbed them without realising the identity of their prisoners. After wandering through the forest for several days, they encountered another outlaw, believed to be the man remembered as Robin of Redesdale. This individual supposedly sheltered them in a hidden cave and later guided them to safety. Whether this story contains any historical truth is uncertain, but it has long been part of local tradition. The Robin of Redesdale, who later became involved in political uprisings, was almost certainly a different person. His family ties to Warwick explain why he played a role in the disturbances that shook northern England in the late 1460s. At that time, Warwick was attempting to challenge the authority of King Edward IV. During the spring of 1469, while rebellion was beginning to spread across the northern counties, another figure emerged under the name Robin of Holderness. This man was Robert Hildyard, the son of a local landowner from the district of Holderness. His uprising had very different origins from the political struggles surrounding Warwick. The immediate cause was resentment over a long-standing tax that required the people of Holderness to provide large quantities of corn to the authorities of a hospital in York. The tax had been unpopular for generations and had been questioned repeatedly in earlier decades. By the late 15th century, the resentment remained strong. Robert Hildyard used this grievance to rally local people to his cause. His movement coincided with the larger rebellion in the north, which has sometimes caused the two events to be confused in later accounts. When the disturbances began to spread, the Earl of Northumberland moved south to restore order. As the king's representative in the region, he had a responsibility to suppress rebellion. Reports claim that Robin of Holderness marched toward York with a large following, hoping to press his demands directly. At the gates of the city, his followers encountered the forces of Northumberland. The confrontation ended quickly. The rebels were scattered and their leader was captured. According to the traditional story, Robin of Holderness was executed at the city gate and his head displayed as a warning. Yet historical records raise questions about this version of events. Documents show that Robert Hildyard, the man widely identified as Robin of Holderness, was still alive years later. Evidence suggests that he continued to serve in military campaigns and was eventually rewarded with knighthood for his service during fighting on the Scottish border. He later attended important political events and remained active in northern affairs well into the 1480s. This contradiction has led to several possible explanations. One possibility is that the man executed at York was not Robert Hildyard, but another rebel who had been mistaken for him. Another theory suggests that the story of the execution may have been exaggerated, or even staged as a demonstration of authority by the Earl of Northumberland. By presenting himself as a defender of royal order, he could strengthen his position with the king during a time of political tension. Whatever the truth, the events surrounding Robin of Holderness played an unexpected role in the shifting power struggles of northern England. Testimony given later about the uprising contributed to decisions made by King Edward IV regarding the leadership of the region. Titles and lands changed hands, altering the balance of influence among the great noble families. In the complex world of late medieval politics, even small local disturbances could produce consequences far beyond their original causes. The story of these two figures, Robin of Redesdale and Robin of Holderness, illustrates how easily legend, rebellion, and political ambition could become intertwined during the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses.